Every era begins with a question. What makes a man defy the world that made him? In the ruins of the Great Depression, when banks collapsed and law lost its meaning, a new kind of man appeared, armed with speed, precision, and the quiet conviction that the rules no longer applied. They weren't revolutionaries. They were reflections. The nation's buried hunger for control, freedom, and revenge made flesh. Among them was one who never slowed down, Lester Joseph Gillis. The papers called him Babyface Nelson. Small in stature, ferocious by instinct. He didn't rob for fame or wealth. He robbed because motion was the only way he knew he was alive. From the frozen woods of Wisconsin to the blood-soaked road at Barrington, his path tore through everything the country believed about law, loyalty, and fear. Each gunshot reshaped the bureau chasing him. Each death taught the government how to kill more efficiently. And somewhere in that violent symmetry, America built the modern idea of justice, cold, organized, and absolute. They said Nelson died on the highway, but that's not true. Part of him lived on, in every badge, every weapon, every system built to prevent another like him. Because sometimes the men we call outlaws are not fighting the law itself. They're proving what it takes to create it. The sky above Barrington, Illinois, was the color of unpolished steel. Late autumn air carried the residue of frost and exhaust as traffic thinned along Northwest Highway. Afternoon light had begun to fail, turning the fields a dull gray that mirrored the mood of a nation weary of manhunts and headlines. The season of gangsters was closing, but not quietly. Lester Joseph Gillis, known to every lawman in America as Babyface Nelson, was steering a stolen Ford V8 toward the final confrontation of his life. He had been restless since dawn. The Bureau had intensified its pursuit, flooding northern Illinois with agents. Nelson, accompanied by his wife Helen and his partner John Paul Chase, shifted from one borrowed hideout to another. Their current car, a maroon Ford coupe, had been taken at gunpoint from a sales lot in Chicago. Its plates did not match its registration. The trunk was loaded with rifles, pistols, and ammunition belts, scavenged from months of flight. Nelson's left hand bore a healing burn from a previous scrape. The knuckles of his right hand were raw from loading magazines. He had not slept properly in days. The only constant was motion. Ahead, the road widened toward a curve flanked by low trees and telephone poles. Nelson's instincts were still acute. He studied every passing vehicle, every reflection in a shop window. The Ford's radiator whined faintly, a reminder of overuse. Helen sat beside him, gloved hands folded, her expression unreadable, behind fatigue and loyalty. Chase rode in the back seat, watching the highway through the small rear window. The trio had driven this route before. It offered quick access to both Chicago and the countryside. But this afternoon, it carried something heavier, an invisible convergence between fugitives and pursuers. Near the town of Fox River Grove, two Bureau agents, Samuel P. Cowley and Herman E. Hollis, were patrolling the same corridor. Their assignment was straightforward: locate and intercept the Ford linked to Nelson. Earlier intelligence had placed him near Lake Geneva. Reports suggested he might be heading toward Chicago. Cowley, tall and methodical, had coordinated the operation from the Bureau's Chicago field office. Hollis, a younger agent with a steady aim, followed his lead. Their vehicle, a government-issued Ford sedan, was equipped with a Thompson submachine gun, shotguns, and pistols. Both men understood the risk. Nelson was not known to surrender. The first crossing occurred near North Fox River Road. A Bureau car, driven by agents Thomas McDade and William Ryan, spotted the maroon Ford traveling fast in the opposite direction. McDade turned sharply and began pursuit. Inside Nelson's car, Chase noticed the movement before anyone else. The sound of the engine rising behind them confirmed what Nelson already expected. His reaction was immediate. Acceleration, evasion, a glance into the side mirror that showed the pursuing car gaining distance. The chase had begun. The Ford roared along the two-lane highway, its tires spitting gravel. Nelson's mechanical intuition guided every maneuver. He weaved through traffic, past slower cars, and forced his pursuers to brake under the sudden surge of speed. Ahead lay the intersection near Barrington, where the road met US Route 14. It was there, in the open stretch flanked by a gas station and a small field, that the collision of outlaws and lawmen would reach its conclusion. McDade and Ryan closed the gap. Shots cracked through the air as Nelson leaned out, firing a burst from his .351 Winchester semi-automatic rifle. Glass shattered from the agent's windshield. They returned fire, forcing Nelson to veer off the road briefly, before regaining control. Another Bureau vehicle joined from the opposite direction. Cowley and Hollis, responding to the radio call. The road between them became a funnel. Nelson's only path lay through it. He swerved into the driveway of the Parkside filling station, a modest structure with fuel pumps, a small office, and an open field beyond. The Ford skidded to a stop beside a ditch. Smoke rose from the hood, where bullets had punctured the radiator. Helen ducked low as hot steam burst from the grill. Chase reached for his Thompson. Nelson stepped out first, crouched low, the rifle tight against his chest. His face, pale, sharp, and deceptively youthful, was set in grim determination. Callie and Hollis halted their sedan on the road, engines idling. Both exited from opposite sides, using the car doors as shields. The distance between them and Nelson was less than 50 yards. McDade's car arrived moments later, parking farther back. Civilians in nearby houses peered from windows, unaware that they were witnessing the final act of one of America's most violent outlaw pursuits. The first exchange erupted without warning. Nelson fired rapidly, the crack of his Winchester echoing through the cold air. Bullets tore into Callie's car, splintering wood and shattering glass. Hollis returned fire with his Thompson, the weapon's steady rhythm vibrating through the stillness. Sparks leapt from the Ford's fender as rounds struck metal. Helen crawled behind the front wheel, clutching the edge of the running board. Chase moved beside her, firing short bursts toward the road. The gunfire blended into a continuous roar, each side discharging round after round, until the air itself seemed to vibrate. Cowley advanced from the driver's side, crouched and deliberate. He reloaded his pistol with measured precision, eyes fixed on the enemy positions. Hollis, slightly ahead, attempted to flank left toward the field. Nelson tracked his movement and pivoted. A bullet struck Hollis in the head, dropping him instantly beside the ditch. Cowley kept firing, even as shrapnel and debris rained around him. One of his rounds hit Nelson in the abdomen, another in the side. The outlaw staggered, but did not fall. He braced against the car door, switched to his Thompson, and unleashed another burst. Cowley collapsed near the rear fender of his own vehicle, mortally wounded. For several seconds, the only sound was the fading clatter of expended shells hitting frozen ground. Then came silence, heavy and uneven, broken only by the hiss of the Ford's damaged radiator. Nelson exhaled hard, lowering his weapon. He turned toward Helen and Chase. His shirt was soaked dark around the stomach. His breath came in shallow pulls. Chase moved to assist him, but Nelson waved him off and began reloading with mechanical focus. The fight had lasted less than 5 minutes. Inside the gas station office, the proprietor had dropped behind a counter, terrified, but unhurt. His telephone hung from its cradle, line open. Somewhere along the wire, a call was already connecting to the local sheriff. The bureau agents lay still beside the road. Passing motorists slowed, then accelerated away in panic. The field smelled of oil, gunpowder, and exhaust. Nelson examined his wounds. The bullet to his side had likely severed an artery. The one in his abdomen had exited through his back. He knew their depth, without needing confirmation. Still, his mind remained sharp. He ordered Chase to gather the weapons and move to the bureau's Ford, which now sat idling unattended. Helen followed, limping slightly from a graze to her leg. Together they transferred guns, ammunition, and the dying Nelson himself into the agent's vehicle. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind 2 dead lawmen and the smoking shell of the maroon Ford. The drive south toward Chicago was a grim procession. Nelson sat upright, in the back seat, his body braced between the door and the window. Each breath was a measured effort, a contest between will and fading strength. Helen drove, Chase navigated. The stolen car carried both the blood of agents and the life of the man who had killed them. They passed through small towns unnoticed, the November dusk deepening into night. The heater barely worked, and cold air seeped through bullet holes in the frame. 10 miles out, Nelson's condition worsened. His speech, once clipped and commanding, had dwindled to hoarse fragments that no one could understand. His skin turned ashen, blood pooled beneath his jacket and along the floor mat. Chase kept looking back, half expecting to see him gone. But Nelson remained conscious, driven by some inner defiance that refused to yield. Every few moments, he adjusted his pistol or checked the remaining ammunition, as though expecting another confrontation. They reached North Rand Road and continued toward Skokie. The landscape shifted from open farmland to scattered homes and warehouses. Streetlights appeared at intervals, dim under the overcast sky. Helen's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The engine sputtered once, caught, and steadied. They were still being pursued in spirit, if not in sight. Radio bulletins had already begun to circulate descriptions of the vehicles involved. Near Niles Center Cemetery, Nelson spoke his last coherent words, short commands, urging them to keep driving. Moments later, his head fell against the seat. Helen felt his pulse weaken beneath her fingers. The outlaw, who had outshot more agents than any other gangster of the decade, was bleeding to death in the back of an FBI car. They turned onto a narrow dirt lane, concealed by trees and gravestones. Chase stopped the car. The headlights cut a dim path across the frozen ground. Helen climbed into the back and tried to lift Nelson's head. His breathing had ceased. The clock on the dashboard read just after 8 o'clock in the evening. Outside, the wind moved softly through the branches. Chase stood motionless beside the car, staring at the man who had defined their existence for the past 2 years. Neither spoke. They simply waited for certainty, for stillness to confirm what instinct already told them. After several minutes, Chase helped Helen drag Nelson's body from the vehicle. They laid him on the slope beside a hedge, covering him partially with a blanket. His face, once deceptively youthful, now appeared older, drained of all vitality. The features that had mocked newspaper artists, the round cheeks, the small stature, were gone. What remained was a shell of exhaustion and gunpowder residue. Helen knelt beside him, her coat stained dark, her expression unreadable. The night around them was silent, except for the ticking of the cooling engine. They re-entered the car and drove toward Wilmette. The plan was improvisational, built entirely on instinct. Helen carried a photograph of the two of them from better days. It remained in her pocket throughout the drive. Chase followed directions without question. They stopped at a roadside park to discard bloodied clothing and spent shells. The cold numbed their hands, but preserved the evidence for the authorities who would find it the next morning. When they reached the safe house of longtime associate Nelson Riddle, Helen stumbled inside and collapsed. Chase explained briefly what had happened before disappearing into the night. By dawn, law enforcement across Illinois was mobilized. Reports came from motorists describing the gunfight near Barrington. Others found the abandoned Ford, still smoldering by the gas station. The bodies of agents Cowley and Hollis were recovered, with assistance from local police. Their service weapons were missing, taken by Nelson in the confusion. At sunrise, officers discovered the corpse near Niles Center Cemetery. Identification came quickly. The fingerprints matched those on record in Washington. Lester Joseph Gillis, alias Babyface Nelson, age 26, career criminal, federal fugitive, and murderer of 2 Bureau agents. Photographs were taken before the body was removed. Newspapers carried the story by afternoon, printing side-by-side portraits of the dead gangster and the agents he had killed. The nation that had followed the exploits of Dillinger, Floyd, and Nelson throughout the year now received its final headline of the gangster era. The Bureau's Chicago field office, transformed overnight into a command center. Director J. Edgar Hoover issued statements lauding the fallen agents and framing the event as the ultimate vindication of federal resolve. The deaths of Cowley and Hollis accelerated reforms already underway. Broader jurisdiction, standardized training, and the arming of field agents with automatic weapons. Nelson's rampage, in dying, had ensured the birth of a new kind of law enforcement. At the Parkside filling station, investigators cataloged the evidence. Hundreds of shell casings littered the ground, each numbered and photographed. The Ford's body was riddled with bullet holes, its tires deflated, its windows shattered. Blood patterns traced the frantic movements of the fight. Locals gathered behind police tape, murmuring disbelief. The gas station owner, shaken but cooperative, pointed out where each man had fallen. The reconstruction confirmed the ferocity of Nelson's resistance. He had fired more rounds than any other outlaw the Bureau had confronted, sustaining fatal wounds yet continuing to attack, until physically incapable of standing. It was the perfect emblem of his nature, unyielding violence, as both creed and identity. In the days that followed, the Bureau dismantled the remnants of his circle. Chase was captured near San Francisco 2 weeks later. After a brief gunfight with federal agents, Helen was taken into custody soon afterward and charged with harboring a fugitive. Her testimony provided the final chronology of Nelson's last hours. Court records preserved her account: the pursuit, the stop at the filling station, the exchange of fire, and the slow death in the back seat. The narrative was cold, factual, devoid of sentiment, exactly as Nelson's life had been lived. By December, the snow had begun to fall across northern Illinois, covering the scarred ground near Barrington. The gas station resumed business, its bullet-pocked walls, a silent monument to the war between outlaws and the Bureau. Travelers who passed rarely knew what had happened there, only weeks before. Yet the Bureau's files grew thicker, the policies more rigid, and the public's appetite for romanticizing bandits began to fade. The image of Nelson persisted for a time. Newspapers reprinted the familiar photographs of his boyish face, his tailored suits, his smirk beside automobiles. But the context had changed. He was no longer an emblem of defiance against Depression-era authority. He was the cautionary endpoint of it. The newspapers that once called him daring now called him mad. The country that once half-admired its outlaws was turning toward order, infrastructure, and the slow restoration of faith in law. Back in Washington, Hoover filed the case, under closed. The Bureau's agents attended the funerals of Cowley and Hollis, standing in rows beneath gray skies. The sound of folded flags and rifle salutes marked the end of the year's bloodshed. The director knew the political weight of the moment. Nelson's death, though costly, had validated his vision of a centralized federal police force. The war on the nation's criminals had entered its institutional phase. As for Nelson, his burial was brief, and unadorned. The body, claimed by family under his real name, was interred in St. Joseph's Cemetery in River Grove. The headstone bore no nickname. Visitors came occasionally, reporters, curious locals, other outlaws soon to meet similar fates, but the grave remained mostly unattended. Time, like the winter snow, covered the details. Yet the echo of that November afternoon lingered. The photographs of the Barrington scene became reference material in bureau training schools. The casing patterns were studied for trajectory. The agent's courage was immortalized in plaques and commendations, and the name Babyface Nelson shifted from headline to history, an object lesson in the limits of violence. By the following spring, the scars along Northwest Highway had faded. The Parkside filling station repainted its walls, the bullet holes filled with plaster. New cars passed daily, their drivers unaware that beneath the thin layer of asphalt lay fragments of brass casings, embedded forever. Somewhere beneath that surface, traces of powder and blood remained, mingled into the soil of a nation that had learned to police itself through loss. In the cold geometry of bureau reports, Nelson's end was summarized in a paragraph. Subject engaged, Special Agents Cowley and Hollis, near Barrington, Illinois. Both agents mortally wounded. Subject died of gunshot wounds, sustained in action. The simplicity of the words belied the violence they described, but the files were not meant for drama. They were meant for closure. And so the story begins, not with birth or ambition, but with its inevitable terminus. A battered Ford steaming beside a country road. The spent cartridges of 2 generations, clattering across frozen ground. In that smoke and silence, the last outlaw of the Depression lay dead, and the age of blood and brass yielded to the age of the badge. Chicago in 1908 was a city of noise and movement, a restless machine of rail lines, smoke, and the low rhythm of industry stretching west from Lake Michigan. On the north side, tenement blocks rose in tight rows along Halsted and Lincoln Avenue. Between them ran alleys slick with runoff from the markets and soot from the coal yards. It was in one of those cramped apartments that Lester Joseph Gillis was born. Small, dark-haired, the son of hard-working immigrants who carried more fatigue than money. The city shaped him from the start. Steam whistles marked his mornings, streetcars his evenings, and the echo of footsteps in narrow hallways taught him that speed and awareness meant survival. Childhood in Chicago's lower wards offered little innocence. The streets were a curriculum. Boys learned trade skills when possible, and crime when not. The Gillis family moved often, chasing affordable rent, while the father worked odd jobs as a tanner and machinist. Lester attended school sporadically. Attendance records show brief enrollments followed by absences too long to excuse. By 10 he had memorized the layout of the local shops and the blind spots of their owners. A pocket knife and quick hands became his tools. The neighborhood gangs, Irish, Polish, and Italian, recruited boys barely older than him to steal tires, copper wire, and gasoline cans. Police patrols were slow, their presence predictable. Opportunity existed in the minutes between their rounds. By adolescence he was small for his age, but fearless, a trait that drew older boys to use him as lookout or decoy. He ran errands for bootleggers, who operated long before Prohibition formalized the trade. His first arrest came around 12, charged with larceny for taking a delivery truck on a joyride down Armitage Avenue. Juvenile court records describe him as polite and quiet, his face making the offense seem improbable. The judge released him to parental custody. Within months he was caught again, this time for burglary. Each return to the reformatory hardened his indifference. The system taught routine, not remorse. By 1918 the Great War had ended, but Chicago's underclass saw little change. Factories laid off men faster than they hired returning soldiers. Speakeasies multiplied, police corruption deepened, and neighborhoods developed their own micro-economies of survival. Lester Gillis, now a wiry teenager with restless energy, found the alleys more instructive than any schoolroom. He joined a group that stripped tires from parked automobiles and resold them to repair shops under assumed names. The profit was small but constant. Violence, when it appeared, was immediate and unhesitating. Brass knuckles, knives, and the occasional revolver borrowed from an uncle's drawer. His appearance remained disarming. Round cheeks, clear skin, eyes that carried neither age nor fear. That contrast became his disguise. Witnesses remembered a boy who smiled even as he emptied cash registers. Police reports began labeling him Babyface, a nickname that would outlast every attempt at reform. Between 15 and 16, he cycled through the state reformatory at Pontiac, twice, each time released with the same warnings. Each stay introduced him to men whose crimes reached beyond theft. Robbers, hijackers, gunmen, who discussed banks instead of bicycles. Their stories fascinated him more than they frightened him. During these years, Chicago's criminal landscape was reorganizing itself. Prohibition approached, and with it the lucrative chaos that would make Al Capone's empire possible. Small gangs competed for delivery routes and warehouse access. Gillis drifted among them, too young to be trusted fully but useful for errands that required speed and invisibility. He learned to hotwire a car, to cut telephone lines, and to stash weapons in ash bins behind tenements. The city's police precincts knew his name. They simply couldn't hold him long enough to make it matter. In 1921, he attempted his first armed robbery, a grocery on Ashland Avenue. The take was negligible, the execution clumsy. He fled on foot and was arrested within hours, after slipping on icy pavement. This time the court sent him to the St. Charles School for Boys, a state reformatory known for discipline and trade training. Records describe him as intelligent, mechanically gifted, and uncooperative. The workshops introduced him to tools he would later use to modify firearms and vehicles. He served nearly a year before release on parole. The institution considered him reformed. He considered it education. Back in Chicago, the city's underworld was transitioning from brawlers to businessmen. Trucks replaced horse carts. Automatic pistols replaced clubs. Gillis adapted quickly. At 16, he joined a crew specializing in car theft. They operated near the stockyards, stripping serial plates and repainting bodies in rented garages. Profits went to bootleg wholesalers, who needed transport immune to police scrutiny. Each successful job increased his confidence and reduced his patience for authority. Arrests followed: grand theft auto, burglary, concealed weapon, but sentences remained light due to age. By 18, he had spent more time in custody than in school, yet emerged each time more deliberate. The contrast between his physical youth and criminal efficiency confused police. Detectives often described him as a kid playing at gunman, yet his file grew thicker. In 1922, he was implicated in a string of garage robberies near Cicero, believed to be supplying stolen parts to Capone's men. Evidence was insufficient for prosecution. He used the reprieve to refine his methods. No longer content with theft, he practiced marksmanship in empty lots, dismantled revolvers to understand their balance, and experimented with homemade silencers. The boy who once stole tires was engineering his transition into armed robbery's mechanical precision. Home offered little deterrent. His parents, weary and resigned, watched him slip further into the city's undercurrent. Domestic stability held no appeal. The thrill of risk provided structure. He associated with men nearly twice his age: drivers, stick-up artists, and low-level enforcers, who respected nerve more than hierarchy. They noticed his calm under pressure. He noticed how quickly fear broke ordinary men. It became his measure of strength. The early 1920s Chicago police force was overextended. Bootlegging routes demanded most resources, leaving car theft and small-scale robberies under-investigated. Gillis exploited that vacuum. His operations expanded to neighboring suburbs: Evanston, Oak Park, Berwyn, where wealth met complacency. There, burglary paid better, and response times were slower. He carried a small .32 automatic, favoring concealment over power. Witnesses later described him as polite, methodical, and smiling as he departed. Each incident added to a legend invisible outside police circles, but notorious within them. The city around him pulsed with contrasts: jazz clubs beside unemployment lines, armored Cadillacs beside horse carts, skyscrapers rising through smog. Organized crime was industrializing. Violence became infrastructure. Gillis, barely out of adolescence, was absorbing its logic. He moved through neighborhoods, like an apprentice in a trade he was destined to master. Arrested again in 1923 for stealing a car near Wrigley Field, he received a 1-year sentence in the House of Correction. There he encountered hardened repeat offenders, who shared contacts and tactics. The prison yard became a recruiting ground. He learned about getaway logistics, bank vault schedules, and the art of altering license numbers without detection. Every conversation was a tutorial in the next stage of his career. Release came in early 1924. Chicago was entering a new phase of volatility. Prohibition had converted petty criminals into entrepreneurs of violence. Machine guns, imported from war surplus, appeared in backroom transactions. Gillis re-entered the city with confidence disproportionate to his age. He dressed sharply, carried himself like someone older, and sought partnership with crews targeting payroll trucks. His childhood had ended without ceremony. What replaced it was purpose stripped of conscience. That year marked his final transition from delinquent to full-fledged outlaw. A payroll robbery on the city's south side went wrong, leaving a guard wounded. Witnesses described a young man of small build firing with both hands, before escaping in a sedan. The description matched Gillis, though charges never stuck. Police surveillance intensified, yet the boyish features made identification unreliable. Newspapers ignored him entirely. The spotlight still belonged to larger syndicates. In obscurity, he refined his craft, preparing unknowingly for the alliances and betrayals that would define the next decade. By 20, he had mastered the essentials: fast cars, clean exits, unflinching violence when cornered. The same streets that had schooled him in petty theft now served as rehearsal for national infamy. Behind the facade of the city's prosperity, Chicago had incubated one of its most relentless sons. The boy from Lincoln Avenue, product of alleys, reform schools, and the mechanical rhythm of crime, was ready for a larger stage. Outside, winter settled again over the lakefront. Street lamps flickered through the fog, reflecting off puddles of oil and melted snow. In that light, the outlines of the future seemed inevitable. A young man already fluent in violence, moving through the city that had taught him both opportunity and indifference. The name Babyface Nelson was not yet printed on wanted posters, but the traits that would define it, speed, defiance, and precision, were already fixed. The streets that raised him had given him every lesson he would ever use and nothing to hold him back. By 1928, the boy who once stole tires had become a man driven by calculation. Chicago had grown into the empire of Capone, where prohibition money carved lines of power through every ward and precinct. Cars multiplied faster than the police could count them, and violence was no longer the disorder of the streets, but the routine of business. Lester Gillis, still in his early 20s, had built a reputation among the city's small armed crews as a man who never hesitated. The name Babyface Nelson circulated quietly between detectives and underworld operators, shorthand for someone deceptively young, unnervingly lethal, and impossible to frighten. He was newly married to Helen Wazenack, a small, dark-haired woman from the neighborhood whose loyalty seemed born more of devotion than illusion. The marriage offered a semblance of domestic structure, though their life together unfolded in the narrow spaces between crimes and flights. They rented cheap apartments under false names, Johnson, Gillen, Halstead, and furnished them sparsely: a table, a radio, a pistol hidden beneath folded laundry. To neighbors they appeared ordinary. The ordinariness was the camouflage Nelson understood best. He lived as though every wall might be temporary. Every sunrise another countdown. The late 1920s brought opportunity for those willing to use violence efficiently. Prohibition had saturated the Midwest, with smuggling routes and armed convoys. Payrolls moved across city streets in armored cars, driven by men with revolvers. Small banks guarded money behind thin counters and thicker illusions of safety. Nelson's skill with engines and weapons gave him leverage. He began orchestrating small robberies with a tight circle of associates, planning every movement with the precision of a mechanic adjusting gears. Entry, intimidation, exit, each time to the second. No grand speeches, no theatrics. The violence came clean and immediate. On the north side, the municipal corruption that once protected small-time thieves had become unpredictable. Detectives demanded larger cuts or delivered harsher penalties. Nelson shifted his operations south and west, targeting stores and gas stations along the edges of Cicero and Aurora, where jurisdiction blurred and response times lagged. The crimes were not spectacular but frequent, building a rhythm that kept him financially solvent and constantly in motion. He changed cars weekly, favoring Fords for their acceleration, and rotated license plates, like playing cards. The city's police bulletins grew accustomed to his pattern. Short man, young face, calm under fire. No arrests stuck long enough to matter. The turning point came with ambition. In 1930, he joined a crew led by an older gunman, planning a bank robbery on Chicago's west side. The target held payroll deposits. For a manufacturing firm, enough cash to tempt even cautious men. The plan was simple: entry at opening, quick withdrawal under threat, and escape through alleys already mapped. But simplicity collapses under chance. A customer entered unexpectedly. Panic spread, and gunfire followed. Nelson, at the counter, fired first, striking a guard in the leg. The crew fled, with only a fraction of the intended haul. Within days, police traced their stolen car to a garage registered under a false name Nelson had used months earlier. Witnesses identified him from photographs. On November 23, 1931, he was arrested and charged with the robbery. His age and size made the arresting officers skeptical at first. The man they caught looked too young to have caused such chaos, but fingerprints confirmed the match. The newspapers barely mentioned the case. Chicago had more notorious figures to occupy its columns, but within law enforcement circles, the name entered permanent circulation. The judge, unmoved by pleas of youth, sentenced him to 1 year to life in the Illinois State Penitentiary at Joliet. It was a sentence designed to break men through uncertainty. For Nelson, it functioned as refinement. Outside, Helen visited occasionally, her letters filled with cautious optimism. She worked under assumed names, shifting between relatives' houses to avoid surveillance. Each visit reminded him of the life paused beyond the walls, a life he would reclaim with interest. The bond between them strengthened, not through tenderness, but through shared defiance. She became the anchor of his secrecy, the only person who would remain beside him when most fled. That loyalty would later define her as much as it doomed her. The prison years coincided with the transformation of American crime. The Lindbergh kidnapping and the rising profile of federal agents were beginning to change public sentiment. Bank robbers became folk legends. Their exploits filled the same papers that ignored their victims. Inmates followed these headlines through smuggled clippings, treating them as instruction manuals. Nelson read them carefully, noting which details of pursuit failed, which escapes succeeded, and how timing dictated survival. He developed an admiration for precision, the difference between daring and stupidity. By mid-1931, parole hearings offered little hope. His record inside was clean enough, but his reputation was not. Officials described him as quiet, industrious, untrustworthy. Behind that civility, they sensed calculation. He learned patience, the way others learned prayer. When permission came to work in the prison machine shop, he took it as training. He repaired tools, adjusted engines, and studied mechanical diagrams. Later, those same skills would turn getaway cars into extensions of his own reflexes. The men he met in Joliet would populate his future like coordinates. Among them were escape artists, safecrackers, and drivers who, once free, would join crews across the Midwest. In letters and smuggled notes, they kept contact, forming an invisible network of ex-convicts ready to reform into gangs the moment opportunity arose. Nelson understood that alliances built inside walls carried more reliability than those outside. Here, loyalty was forged by necessity and betrayal punished without mediation. Parole arrived unexpectedly late in 1931, after 11 months served. He walked out through the front gate, wearing state-issued clothes and the expression of a man who had finished a course rather than a sentence. The city awaiting him was darker than the one he had left. The Great Depression had deepened. Banks were closing weekly, and the authority of police seemed reduced to ceremony. Armed men roamed freely under the guise of bootleggers and security contractors. Nelson returned not as a petty thief, but as a graduate of organized violence. Joliet had not reformed him. It had certified him. Back in Chicago, he reconnected with Helen and resumed life under another alias. Employment was scarce, but crime provided its own economy. Within weeks, he reunited with old contacts from the reformatory system, several of whom had already begun targeting banks. They spoke of fast cars, automatic weapons, and new escape techniques learned from other states. Nelson listened, adjusted their plans with mechanical logic, and assumed command. He tested new handguns, favoring the Colt .38 Super for its reliability. Each movement now carried the discipline of his prison training, measured, deliberate, stripped of sentiment. To outsiders, his transformation appeared abrupt. To those who knew him, it was the natural evolution of a temperament honed since childhood. He had learned that survival demanded control of speed, of fear, of outcomes. Risk no longer thrilled him. It organized him. The same streets that once offered mischief now offered blueprints for raids. Bank tellers, guards, and patrol routes became moving pieces on a board. He already knew by instinct. Every robbery thereafter bore his signature, brief, explosive, and absolute. The authorities who had underestimated him during adolescence now faced a new adversary, smaller in frame than most, but infinitely more dangerous. Reports from late 1931 describe multiple holdups fitting his method. Daylight, minimal talk, calculated aggression. The victim survived, the lesson did not. Nelson's reputation expanded beyond Chicago into neighboring states through whispered accounts exchanged between police departments, still lacking coordination. The federal government had not yet assumed jurisdiction over interstate crime, but its agents were watching. Names like Dillinger, Van Meter, and Floyd were beginning to circulate. Nelson, though not yet among them, was moving inevitably toward their orbit. At night, he studied road maps under dim light, tracing lines from Illinois to Wisconsin, from Indiana to Minnesota. The roads became arteries of freedom and pursuit alike. He memorized distances between gas stations, bridge tolls, and state lines. When he drove, Helen sat beside him, her silence equal to his. Their marriage functioned less as romance than as partnership in exile. She carried weapons in her handbag and learned to pack in minutes. Each day on the run reinforced their dependence, each success their belief in invincibility. The closing months of 1931 positioned Nelson precisely where fate required, trained, married, armed, and unrepentant. The city that had once been his playground was now too small for his ambition. He needed wider roads, broader targets, and accomplices who shared his appetite for escalation. Those would come soon, summoned by coincidence and shared desperation. For now, he moved through Chicago's underbelly, like a shadow preparing for definition. When the first snow of winter fell across the rooftops, he stood watching from an apartment window, cigarette unlit between his fingers. Cars passed below, their headlights cutting narrow paths through the flurries. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the next stage of his education, the escape that would carry him across states and into the mythology of the decade. But for the moment, there was only stillness, a city asleep beneath frost, and a man who had learned that confinement, like fear, was only temporary. Winter in Illinois carried the kind of cold that slowed even breath. In February 1932, the state prison system was strained by overcrowding and the monotony of routine transfers between county jails. Few prisoners believed freedom possible. Fewer still prepared for it, with precision. Lester Gillis had studied every weak seam in the system since the day of his sentencing. When his chance came, it arrived not as opportunity, but as inevitability. He was among several inmates scheduled for transport from the state penitentiary back to the Will County Jail for further proceedings. The group left Joliet on the morning of February 17th escorted by armed guards in a standard transfer vehicle. Chains linked their wrists, and cold seeped through the metal floor. Outside, wind swept snow across the roads. For the guards, it was another uneventful movement of prisoners. For Nelson, it was the single variable he could still control: timing. The details would later appear in bureau and state reports, somewhere along the rural stretch near Evanston. One of the prisoners feigned illness. As the guard turned, Nelson and another man lunged. The exact sequence remains debated. Whether a smuggled weapon, a concealed file, or pure improvisation started the revolt. But the result was certain. Within seconds, the rear door burst open, the guards overpowered, and 2 inmates vanished into the frozen fields. The others stayed behind, stunned by the speed of it. Nelson ran without looking back. He reached a line of trees before the shouts faded. Snow crunched under thin shoes. Chains cut into his wrists, until he wrenched them loose against a stone. Every movement was calculated. Direction toward the nearest road, eyes scanning for any farmhouse or passing truck. He found a creek bed, partially frozen, and followed it for half a mile, using its curve to mask footprints. The cold worked in his favor. No scent for dogs, visibility reduced, and the human instinct to stay indoors. By nightfall, he had stolen a coat from a clothesline and a small revolver from a truck's glove compartment. Freedom, though incomplete, had begun. In the weeks that followed, Nelson moved with the discipline of an animal born to flight. Newspaper bulletins reported the escape briefly. His name meant little outside Chicago. He traveled south through Illinois, sleeping in barns and freight cars, trading petty theft for distance. The Depression had filled the rail lines with drifters, and the roads with desperation. A fugitive could vanish among thousands, without raising suspicion. By March, he had crossed into Missouri, following freight routes toward Kansas City. There, rumor and survival intersected. Criminal networks spanning the Midwest offered safe houses to those who could pay or prove useful. Nelson did both. Kansas City in early 1932 was a hub of contraband and corruption, a place where bootleggers, safecrackers, and fugitives shared lodging without curiosity. Nelson worked under the alias Jimmy Gillis, posing as a mechanic in garages, tied to rum-running operations. The money was minor, but it purchased information, names, routes, and contacts extending west. He learned of a man named John Paul Chase, a former machinist turned liquor smuggler, operating out of California. Chase had connections to suppliers in the Bay Area, and a reputation for competence. For Nelson, competence mattered more than loyalty. He followed the rumor west. The journey to California took weeks. He rode freight trains across plains, changed lines in Denver, and arrived in San Francisco under the haze of late spring. The city smelled of salt and oil, its docks crowded with cargo from the Pacific. Prohibition still dictated its rhythm. Warehouses filled with imported whiskey, guarded by men who trusted money more than law. Nelson adapted quickly, finding work as a driver in operations moving liquor along the coastal highways. The pay was good, the risk constant. Each shipment taught him routes, distances, and the art of mechanical deception. How to disguise a smuggler's car as a delivery vehicle. How to install hidden compartments beneath the chassis. How to keep law enforcement perpetually minutes behind. It was during one of these operations that he met Chase. The older man was cautious, methodical, and notably reserved. He lacked Nelson's volatility, but shared his efficiency. Their introduction was transactional. A driver needing a partner who could shoot. A gunman needing an employer who understood speed. Together they formed a symmetry rare in outlaw history. Chase's composure balancing Nelson's intensity. They began with short runs. Liquor deliveries between Sausalito, Petaluma, and Santa Rosa. Police patrols were easily avoided. Bribes smoothed the rest. What began as business evolved into camaraderie, born of risk. Nelson's habits impressed even the hardened smugglers. He maintained his weapons like a craftsman, disassembling and oiling them nightly. He tested every vehicle before departure, memorized alternate routes, and timed responses to potential roadblocks. Chase observed the discipline with silent respect. It was clear that the small man with the boyish face approached crime with the logic of engineering. He anticipated every failure point. In a world where chance decided most outcomes, Nelson built systems to replace it. Their operations grew bolder. By mid-1932, the pair expanded beyond liquor to armed robberies, targeting payroll couriers and isolated stores across Northern California. The crimes were quick and violent, executed with precision. Witnesses described a smiling gunman of small stature, courteous until opposed. Newspapers began noting the pattern, but lacked names. For Nelson, anonymity was armor. For Chase, it was reassurance. They traveled constantly, renting cabins under aliases, paying in cash, leaving before sunrise. The Pacific coast, with its cliffs and fog, became their refuge. Meanwhile, federal and state authorities in Illinois continued to search, unaware that their escaped prisoner had built a new identity 3 states away. The Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation agency, still defining its role, had limited jurisdiction. Without interstate coordination, Nelson's file gathered dust. The delay gave him time to mature from fugitive to strategist. His methods evolved. He studied maps, traffic patterns, and the response times of local police. He experimented with disguises, different hats, coats, even facial hair. Though his stature remained unmistakable, he compensated by controlling situations before anyone could observe details. In Sausalito, he and Chase found semi-permanent housing above a repair shop, overlooking the bay. From there they planned robberies extending north into Oregon and east toward Nevada. The distances blurred, each job financed the next. Their arsenal expanded, sawed-off shotguns, automatics, ammunition boxes stored beneath false floors. Nelson, fascinated by machinery, modified triggers and shortened barrels for concealment. His understanding of firearms turned mechanical curiosity into lethal precision. The line between bootlegger and outlaw dissolved that summer. Liquor deliveries, faded as bank money, proved more profitable. The pair joined others from the underworld's periphery, forming temporary crews that dissolved after each robbery. Trust was transactional. Betrayal was assumed. Still, Nelson's leadership emerged naturally. He demanded punctuality and order, punishing carelessness with silent contempt rather than outburst. In the coded hierarchy of criminals, efficiency commanded respect. Late in 1932, violence escalated. During a robbery near Reno, a store clerk resisted. Nelson shot him without hesitation. The act shocked even Chase, though outwardly he showed nothing. From that moment, the crimes grew darker, more impulsive. Nelson's need for control intertwined with an increasing reliance on aggression. He had learned in prison that intimidation was more reliable than persuasion. Now he applied it indiscriminately. Each success emboldened him further, eroding restraint. Federal investigators began linking unsolved murders across states by ballistic evidence, a rare practice at the time. The .45 caliber rounds matched each other too closely to ignore. Reports circulated through law enforcement channels, mentioning a small gunman with an untraceable history. None realized the connection to the Illinois fugitive until much later. For now, Nelson remained a ghost, moving along the West Coast with the confidence of invisibility. As the year closed, he sent word to Helen through intermediaries. The message was simple: travel west. She joined him in early 1933, under the alias Helen Gillis, pretending to be a traveling wife. To neighbors they appeared ordinary. Once again, the reunion solidified their partnership into a mobile triangle: Nelson, Helen, and Chase, each fulfilling a role in the mechanics of survival. Helen handled logistics, lodging, and alibis. Chase managed transport and finance. Nelson planned and executed. The household revolved around secrecy maintained through routine. Their route eventually circled back eastward. The Midwest remained lucrative for robbery, and Nelson's restlessness demanded familiar ground. They departed California in autumn 1933, driving across Nevada toward Colorado, their car loaded with weapons and stolen cash. The journey was cautious, stopping only for fuel and brief sleep in roadside cabins. Lawmen along the route noticed nothing unusual: a young couple and a quiet driver passing through. By the time they reached Illinois, Nelson had transformed fully into a professional criminal, whose every instinct operated between speed and violence. Behind him, the Bay Area underworld whispered of the small man who never missed, the one who left witnesses alive only when they posed no threat. Stories inflated, mixed with truth, and drifted east through rumor. By the time he re-entered Chicago, his legend had preceded him. Within months, that legend would merge with the names of Dillinger, Van Meter, and the network of gangsters reshaping the Bureau's future. But for now, in early 1933, the fugitive from Joliet had succeeded in something rare: complete reinvention. The police in Illinois still searched farmhouses and rail lines for traces of a prisoner long gone, unaware that he had crossed thousands of miles and returned by his own design. The man they had lost in the snowfields of February was gone entirely, replaced by a figure of precision and calculated ferocity. He kept his guns clean, his car tuned, his conscience silent. Each town looked the same through the windshield: streets, lights, and escape routes. In motels, he dismantled weapons on nightstands, checked ammunition, and studied maps by lamplight. Helen read newspapers aloud, circling reports of robberies similar to theirs. Chase balanced ledgers of stolen cash, as though managing a business. Between them stretched an unspoken understanding: there would be no peace, only movement, until the road itself ended. By the winter of 1933, snow once again covered the Midwest. Nelson drove through it, with steady hands, untroubled by memory. The same cold that had aided his escape a year earlier now followed him home. Every breath of frost against the windshield recalled that first sprint through the fields, the sound of guards shouting behind him. He had outrun them then. He would keep outrunning them, until the chase itself defined who he was. But for now, in early 1933, the fugitive from Joliet had succeeded in something rare: complete reinvention. The police in Illinois still searched farmhouses and rail lines for traces of a prisoner long gone, unaware that he had crossed thousands of miles and returned by his own design. The man they had lost in the snowfields of February was gone entirely, replaced by a figure of precision and calculated ferocity. He kept his guns clean, his car tuned, his conscience silent. Each town looked the same through the windshield: streets, lights, and escape routes. In motels, he dismantled weapons on nightstands, checked ammunition, and studied maps by lamplight. Helen read newspapers aloud, circling reports of robberies similar to theirs. Chase balanced ledgers of stolen cash, as though managing a business. Between them stretched an unspoken understanding. There would be no peace, only movement until the road itself ended. By the winter of 1932-1933, snow once again covered the Midwest. Nelson drove through it with steady hands, untroubled by memory. The same cold that had aided his escape a year earlier now followed him home. Every breath of frost against the windshield recalled that first sprint through the fields, the sound of guards shouting behind him. He had outrun them then. He would keep outrunning them until the chase itself defined who he was. The years between 1932 and 1933 marked the border between disorder and design in America's criminal landscape. Prohibition was eroding, but the structures it had built, smuggling routes, black market financiers, and an army of armed transporters, remained. In that vacuum, the fugitives who survived by adaptation thrived longest. Lester Gillis, now living entirely beneath his adopted name, had learned that mobility was safety. He stayed in motion across 3 states, rarely sleeping in the same bed twice, his existence traced only through spent cartridges and stolen cars. In Northern California, the partnership with John Paul Chase matured into precision. Chase provided calm calculation, Nelson provided aggression. Between them ran an understanding measured not in trust, but in performance. Each robbery tested the other's timing. Each escape reinforced the rule that emotion was a liability. They operated from Sausalito to Stockton, robbing small banks and liquor depots. Nelson handled the entry himself, swift, direct, a pistol in each hand, while Chase waited behind the wheel, engine running, escape route memorized. The money was modest, but consistent, enough to fund new weapons and faster cars. For Nelson, profit mattered less than momentum. By early 1933, the operation extended inland. Nevada and Utah offered emptier roads and slower law enforcement. On those routes, the pair refined their methods. Chase's machinist background made him an expert at maintaining vehicles pushed to mechanical extremes. Nelson, fascinated by precision, modified firing pins and cut down rifle barrels for concealment. Each improvement shortened their exposure time by seconds that could mean life or death. In notebooks, he kept figures, distances, average police response times, gas consumption under pursuit. Crime, for him, had become engineering. Violence followed without hesitation. During a liquor transport hijacking near Reno that spring, a security guard resisted and drew his weapon. Nelson fired before the man could raise it. Witnesses described a small shooter stepping forward, aiming deliberately, and leaving as calmly as he had arrived. The killing spread fear among smugglers who until then had treated robbery as business negotiation. Now it became warfare. Rumors reached California that the short gunman with the young face would rather kill than risk recognition. Chase heard them too, but said nothing. Their partnership survived on results, not conscience. They moved north after the Reno killing, crossing Oregon toward Washington, and back through Idaho. The car, a Ford V8 bought under a false name, served as home, armory, and office. Nelson drove at night, headlights dimmed, radio on low to catch police bulletins. The patterns fascinated him. Most departments communicated by telephone, some by telegraph. Delays of 30 minutes between sightings gave him confidence and invisibility. That confidence hardened into contempt. He believed he could predict the law's movements as easily as road curves. In May 1933, they headed east toward the Twin Cities. Minneapolis, swollen by trade and corruption, mirrored Chicago on a smaller scale. Bootleggers still operated, despite the coming repeal. Crooked cops sold protection to anyone with cash. The environment suited Nelson perfectly. Law enough to manipulate, chaos enough to disappear. They rented an apartment under the names Mr. and Mrs. Halstead, with Chase listed as a relative. Helen arrived weeks later, completing the triangle. Her presence restored domestic pattern. She cooked, cleaned weapons, and memorized alibis. Outwardly, they were an ordinary family. In reality, they were assembling the blueprint for a mobile criminal unit. Violence followed, without hesitation. During a liquor transport hijacking near Reno that spring, a security guard resisted and drew his weapon. Nelson fired before the man could raise it. Witnesses described a small shooter stepping forward, aiming deliberately, and leaving as calmly as he had arrived. The killing spread fear among smugglers, who until then had treated robbery as business negotiation. Now it became warfare. Rumors reached California that the short gunman with the young face would rather kill than risk recognition. Chase heard them too, but said nothing. Their partnership survived on results, not conscience. They moved north after the Reno killing, crossing Oregon toward Washington and back through Idaho. The car, a Ford V8, bought under a false name, served as home, armory, and office. Nelson drove at night, headlights dimmed, radio on low to catch police bulletins. The patterns fascinated him. Most departments communicated by telephone, some by telegraph. Delays of 30 minutes between sightings gave him confidence in invisibility. That confidence hardened into contempt. He believed he could predict the law's movements as easily as road curves. In May 1933, they headed east toward the Twin Cities. Minneapolis, swollen by trade and corruption, mirrored Chicago on a smaller scale. Bootleggers still operated, despite the coming repeal. Crooked cops sold protection to anyone with cash. The environment suited Nelson perfectly. Law enough to manipulate, chaos enough to disappear. They rented an apartment under the names Mr. and Mrs. Halstead, with Chase listed as a relative. Helen arrived weeks later, completing the triangle. Her presence restored domestic pattern. She cooked, cleaned weapons, and memorized alibis. Outwardly, they were an ordinary family. In reality, they were assembling the blueprint for a mobile criminal unit. Through summer and autumn, 1933, their movements formed a loop of survival. Illinois to Wisconsin, Nebraska to Colorado, then back again. They robbed banks rarely now, preferring smaller but safer targets. Armored car drivers, payroll couriers, rural stores with minimal alarm systems. The amounts were small compared with later operations, but they maintained steady financing. Each heist rehearsed coordination, timing, and withdrawal under fire. Nelson insisted on precision shooting drills at deserted quarries, forcing Chase and Helen to practice reloading and marksmanship until fatigue numbed their hands. He measured groupings on targets, recorded distances, and adjusted accordingly. What others called crime, he called routine maintenance. Law enforcement's understanding lagged months behind. State police shared information sporadically. Federal agents lacked authority across borders. When a payroll guard was found dead near Minden, Nevada, local deputies blamed bandits from California. When a similar killing occurred outside Minneapolis, suspicion fell on local bootleg remnants. Only later did ballistic comparisons suggest the same weapon. Mode 45 automatic modified for rapid fire. The Bureau began assembling fragments into a picture still incomplete but closing. Meanwhile, Prohibition ended. December 1933 brought repeal of the 18th Amendment and the slow disintegration of the bootleg economy that had sustained so many outlaws. For most smugglers, it signaled retirement or ruin. For Nelson, it meant opportunity. The liquor routes once policed by rival gangs were now vacant corridors, ideal for movement. He saw the coming shift before others. Robbery, not smuggling, would become the next profitable frontier. Banks were vulnerable. Armored cars carried payrolls for collapsing companies. To dominate that terrain, he needed partners of similar ambition. The path would soon lead him toward the Dillinger Circle. Before that, convergence. 1933 closed with exhaustion and paranoia. They wintered in Chicago under false identities, renting rooms through intermediaries connected to the old North Side bootleg network. The city's underworld had changed since his imprisonment. Capone gone to Alcatraz, new factions dividing his empire, detectives more cautious under federal scrutiny. Nelson moved carefully, but could not remain still. He visited old contacts for information on bank security, police schedules, and possible recruits. His reputation, half rumor, half record, preceded him. Men who once dismissed him as a reckless boy now recognized the efficiency behind the brutality. Helen's role deepened during these months. She handled communication, coded letters, and supply runs while maintaining the facade of respectability. To hotel clerks, she was the quiet wife of a traveling salesman. To police surveillance, an unremarkable woman in a wool coat. Her devotion was total, rooted not in illusion, but in shared isolation. Chase remained the intermediary, managing cash deposits and mechanical upkeep. The trio functioned as a machine, each component dependent on the other, none replaceable. Early 1934 approached with tension disguised as calm. Nelson spent evenings testing new vehicles, purchased through intermediaries. His obsession with horsepower bordered on scientific. He timed acceleration against stopwatches, modified carburetors, and installed bullet-resistant glass where possible. The Ford V8 became his signature tool, fast, sturdy, and expendable. When mechanics questioned his intensity, he paid double and left before questions could continue. Each car, to him, was another step toward inevitability. In December 1933, during a brief stay near Lake Geneva, he learned through contacts of a new gang assembling under John Dillinger, a crew known for audacity and planning equal to his own. Their operations already reached Indiana and Ohio. Their success attracted both admiration and pursuit. Nelson studied newspaper reports describing Dillinger's precision and escape record. He recognized himself in those accounts. The same reliance on speed, the same disregard for authority. A collision between them was certain, though neither yet knew its shape. As the year ended, the Midwest lay under snow again, echoing the conditions of his escape a year earlier. Nelson stood at the threshold of notoriety, poised between the anonymity of the fugitive and the fame of public enemy. The bodies left behind in Reno and Minneapolis marked his ascent not in wealth, but in certainty, proof that violence, when executed without hesitation, granted temporary immortality. The Bureau's files were swelling. Agents in Chicago whispered his name, as rumor turned into directive. Within months he would join forces that would define the final bloody chapter of America's gangster decade. For now, the trio drove east once more, their Ford's headlights cutting through snow-laden darkness. In the back seat lay duffel bags of weapons, stolen cash wrapped in oilcloth, and maps inked with possible routes. Ahead waited a future already written in police bulletins. Each mile carried them closer to convergence, the moment when small-time precision met national spectacle. And the quiet partnership of three fugitives became part of a legend built entirely on speed, smoke, and the certainty that no one outran death forever. The winter of 1934 found the nation exhausted by its own outlaws. Newspapers still replayed the stories of John Dillinger's jailbreak from the Indiana State Prison and his subsequent robberies across the Midwest. To the Bureau of Investigation, the hunt for Dillinger was no longer about a man but a test of federal reach. Every patrol car, every agent's file, carried the sense that the law itself was being measured. Into this moment of escalation stepped Lester Gillis, babyface Nelson, returning to Chicago with precision sharpened by exile. He made contact through intermediaries who moved between the city's gambling rooms and safe houses. The underworld functioned like an electrical grid. Information traveled invisibly until it sparked connection. Nelson's reputation preceded him. Small, volatile, efficient, Dillinger's newly formed gang needed men who could handle automatic weapons and fast cars. Nelson needed an organization with resources and reach. Their meeting, arranged through Homer Van Meter and Tommy Carroll, joined two philosophies of violence. Dillinger sought mastery of planning. Nelson sought the purity of execution. Together they formed a temporary alignment that would make 1934 the bloodiest year in Bureau history. Within weeks, Nelson was participating in a string of bank robberies that stretched from Indiana to South Dakota. The operations followed Dillinger's blueprint: daylight entry, intimidation of employees, precision timing, and carefully mapped escape routes. Nelson's role was always the same: advance guard and rear guard simultaneously, the first through the door and the last to withdraw. His energy unsettled even the hardened veterans. During the Mason City, Iowa job, he fired warning shots at approaching police before the alarm fully sounded, giving the getaway car critical seconds. Dillinger later described him privately as reckless but indispensable. The Bureau's reports called him psychopathic in courage. The profits funded a life perpetually on the move. The gang alternated between safe houses in Chicago, St. Paul, and Minneapolis, using corrupt officials to secure temporary immunity. The St. Paul Police Protection System, an arrangement where outlaws paid bribes to be left undisturbed, kept them comfortable for a time. In rented apartments they drank, cleaned weapons, and read newspapers tracking their own manhunt. Nelson spent hours modifying his Thompson submachine gun, cutting the barrel and polishing the action until it operated with mechanical perfection. He carried spare magazines in tailored pockets, sewn by Helen. Every sound of metal against metal calmed him more than conversation ever could. Helen's transformation from anxious wife to practiced accomplice completed during these months. She drove getaway cars, maintained false identifications, and learned to recognize surveillance. Her world narrowed to the rhythm of sirens and safe houses. Her loyalty absolute. The newspapers began printing her photograph, beside his labeling her the most dangerous woman in America. The title was inaccurate but inevitable. Association was guilt enough. By March 1934, federal pursuit intensified. Director J. Edgar Hoover had reorganized the Bureau into a national force, authorizing automatic weapons and cross-state authority. Agents circulated Dillinger's photograph to every police department in the country. Nelson's image followed, smaller but equally distributed. The line between state and federal law blurred. The gang's network began to fracture under constant pressure. Arrests and shootouts followed, one in Tucson, another in Chicago, each thinning their numbers. Yet Nelson's confidence remained untouched. He told associates, through action rather than words, that velocity itself was survival. He changed cars daily, swapped license plates hourly, and measured safety in minutes. The spring robberies funded new hideouts. In April, the surviving core, Dillinger, Van Meter, Carroll, Nelson, Helen, and a few others, retreated north toward Wisconsin, seeking seclusion in the woods near Little Bohemia Lodge, on Star Lake. The lodge, owned by Emil Winotka, appeared isolated enough for rest. They arrived carrying trunks of weapons, money, and luggage under assumed names. For 2 days, the forced quiet deceived them into believing the chase had paused. They cooked meals, repaired weapons, and slept without the constant hum of engines. Helen walked the frozen edge of the lake while Nelson and Chase tested rifles against tree trunks. The brief illusion of safety masked the inevitability of disaster. The Bureau's information network, however, was tightening. Local informants reported suspicious activity at the lodge. Expensive cars, heavy luggage, guarded behavior. Within 48 hours, federal agents under Hugh Cummings and W. Carter Baum mobilized from St. Paul, coordinating with Wisconsin police. The plan was simple: surround the lodge at night and capture the fugitives without casualties. Simplicity failed against miscommunication. On the evening of April 22, 1934, as the agents approached, a series of mistakes shattered the calm. A local resident returning from work drove past their hidden vehicles. Agents fired, believing he was an escaping outlaw. The gunfire alerted the lodge. Inside, Nelson reacted first. He grabbed his rifle, shouted warnings, and burst through the rear door before anyone else moved. Dillinger and the others scattered. The first agent to appear on the property was Baum, advancing cautiously through the darkness with 2 companions. Nelson opened fire. Without hesitation, bullets tore through the pine air, striking Baum fatally and wounding another. The agents returned fire, but Nelson had already melted into the woods, his small figure swallowed by the trees. The chaos spread in all directions. Dillinger and Van Meter escaped through the front, exchanging fire with the panicked agents, who still believed they surrounded the entire gang. In the confusion, Helen was separated, later captured while attempting to flee along the highway. Nelson disappeared into the forest alone, his instinct for evasion honed by years of pursuit. By dawn, Little Bohemia was littered with shell casings and broken windows. The Bureau had failed spectacularly. 1 agent dead, others wounded, and the outlaws gone. Newspapers the next morning described it as a federal disaster. Hoover responded by ordering an all-out manhunt. Nelson's flight through the Wisconsin woods lasted 2 days. He stole a car from a farmhouse, then another, traveling south through back roads toward Chicago. Cold rain fell continuously, washing blood from his hands, but not the image fixed now in national headlines. Killing a federal agent elevated him beyond ordinary criminality. His face joined Dillinger's on post office walls across the country. The reward doubled. Every highway patrolman in the Midwest carried his description. Nelson himself seemed invigorated by the escalation. To him, the Bureau's pursuit validated his existence. Helen, held briefly by authorities, was released for lack of evidence and reunited with him weeks later through intermediaries. The reunion was cautious, but inevitable. They rented new lodgings under false names near Chicago's north side, maintaining silence, waiting for news of the gang's next move. Dillinger, already slipping from hiding, remained the figurehead, but Nelson had become its most unpredictable element, the man who turned survival into confrontation. Through spring and early summer, the fugitives regrouped in fragments. Dillinger's famous plastic surgery altered his face but not his habits. Nelson avoided hospitals and treated his minor wounds at home with Helen's help. The couple lived under constant readiness. Suitcases packed, car fueled, cash divided into envelopes. Federal agents raided apartments weekly, often minutes after they had departed. The margin between capture and escape measured the precision of their routines. In June, Dillinger organized another bank raid in South Bend, Indiana. Nelson insisted on joining, despite growing friction within the group. The robbery on June 30th, 1934, erupted into gunfire almost immediately. A police officer was killed. Witnesses reported a small man wielding twin automatics with mechanical calm. The description left no doubt. The Bureau now identified Nelson as public enemy number 2, directly below Dillinger himself. Within 3 weeks, Dillinger would be dead outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago, leaving Nelson as the new symbol of the outlaw era. Dillinger's death on July 22nd shifted the entire landscape. The Bureau, desperate for closure, redirected every resource toward Nelson. Hoover framed the narrative personally. The Dillinger gang was destroyed, but one fragment remained, the most dangerous one. Posters declared him armed, ruthless, and likely to kill rather than surrender. Agents began tracing not only his movements but Helen's, recognizing that she remained his only consistent companion. Surveillance reports noted her visits to safe houses, her coded mail, her patterns of travel. Every detail became evidence in the slow tightening of a net still invisible to its prey. Through late summer, Nelson and Chase, once more reunited, moved through the Midwest robbing small banks and supply depots. The amounts mattered less than defiance. Nelson refused to disappear quietly, as others did. He attacked whenever cornered, firing until his guns emptied, then stealing the pursuer's car to escape. The Bureau's files grew thicker, photographs of spent shell casings attached to each report like recurring signatures. Every investigation read the same. Same weapon, same tactics, same escape. He was no longer simply a man being hunted but a method being studied. By autumn, The pattern of movement became predictable. Chicago to Wisconsin, then west to Nebraska and back. Each region left its own scar of robbery, pursuit, and retreat. Helen endured it with mechanical patience, her loyalty fused with exhaustion. Chase began to sense the trajectory, each job shorter, each escape narrower. The cycle was closing, though none could see its exact point of collapse. The gang that had assembled in early 1934 was nearly gone by year's end. Dillinger, Van Meter, Carroll, all dead within months. What remained were fragments, bound less by alliance than by shared inevitability. Nelson stood at the center of that fragmentation, the embodiment of resistance to capture. Every mile he drove, every magazine he loaded, was another defiance of order. Yet even defiance has limits measured in blood and distance. By October, the Bureau had formalized its transformation into the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agents carried new authority, new weapons, and orders that left no space for surrender. Nelson, already wounded in spirit if not yet in body, responded with the only language he knew: motion and fire. The collision was coming, predetermined by every choice since Joliet. The man who had escaped through snow would soon meet the same cold road again, this time not as fugitive, but as legend ending in smoke. The formation of the Dillinger gang had given Nelson the infrastructure he needed to perfect his craft. Its destruction left him alone, with nothing to restrain it. As winter approached, he drove across Illinois under another alias, the Ford's engine humming steady beneath a gray sky. In the rear seat lay his Thompson, oiled and loaded. Helen sat beside him, silent, watching the barren fields slide past. Behind them trailed 1,000 miles of pursuit. Ahead waited the inevitable convergence at Barrington. The road was already written, and the man driving it no longer distinguished between movement and destiny. The forest around Manitowish, Wisconsin, was still half frozen. In April 19th, the air raw with the residue of winter. The little Bohemia Lodge, a rustic retreat of log walls and pine smoke, sat isolated among birch trees, overlooking Star Lake. It promised silence and distance, two luxuries the Dillinger gang had not known for months. When they arrived late, on April 19th, they believed, briefly, that seclusion could purchase safety. For Lester Gillis, the outlaw now known to every federal office as Babyface Nelson, the lodge represented both refuge and stage. They came in convoy: Dillinger, Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, Nelson, Helen, and several associates. The cars, dark sedans, and a newly stolen Hudson, were parked behind the lodge away from the road. Inside, owner Emil Wanatka offered them cabins and meals, unaware of their identities, until the radio betrayed them. Reports of Dillinger sightings, sketches matching his guests. The realization transformed him into an unwilling participant. Fear and curiosity held him silent long enough for the Bureau to catch scent of the hideout through a local informant. The clock toward disaster began ticking. For 2 days, the gang treated the lodge as temporary sanctuary. They ate late, kept weapons close, and slept in shifts. Nelson moved with restless energy, checking the cars, testing magazines, and pacing between the lodge and the frozen lake. He mistrusted calm. Helen, accustomed to motion, found the stillness suffocating. Dillinger, outwardly composed, tried to project confidence, but studied road maps daily, knowing pursuit was inevitable. Every member of the gang felt the tightening of distance, the sensation that each safe house lasted half the time of the last. The Bureau's arrival was swift and uncoordinated. Agents from the Chicago and St. Paul offices converged under Inspector Samuel Cowley and Agent Hugh Cummings, numbering around 20 in total. They carried Tommy guns, shotguns, and a single aim: capture the fugitives alive. But the terrain and the hour conspired against them. The road to the lodge wound through forest dense enough to conceal an army, yet the agents arrived in a convoy of cars, whose engines carried across the lake. By the time they assembled their plan, darkness had settled. Lanterns flickered against wet pine trunks. Instructions scattered between them: encircle, advance, hold fire until confirmation. None would be followed correctly. Around 9 o'clock, a local laborer named John Hoffman left the lodge in his Ford sedan after visiting friends. Unaware of the impending raid, he drove down the main road, just as agents were positioning themselves. Mistaking the sound of his engine for an escaping outlaw, they opened fire. The car exploded with shattered glass and ricocheting bullets. Hoffman was wounded, his companion killed instantly. The gunfire thundered across the forest and through the lodge's walls. Inside, Nelson reacted first. His instincts, honed through years of pursuit, translated confusion into action. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition, motioned for Helen to stay low, and charged through the back door into the freezing night. Dillinger and Van Meter rushed in opposite directions, shouting warnings lost in the din. Panic shredded the gang's coordination. Windows burst under stray bullets. Splinters rained from log walls. The night that was meant to deliver capture instead descended into chaos. Nelson sprinted toward the tree line, his small frame vanishing into the black. Agents advancing from the road saw only flickers of movement between trunks, and opened fire. He dropped behind a boulder, returned a short burst, and continued uphill. In the confusion, Agent W. Carter Baum and two companions, John McCormick and E.J. Hollis, arrived in a separate car, unaware that the assault had already begun. They parked near a side cabin, where Nelson now crouched unseen among trees. What followed lasted less than a minute, but defined his legend. As the agents approached the cabin, Nelson rose from concealment, rifle braced against his shoulder. Baum called out an order that vanished under the crack of gunfire. Bullets struck him in the chest and head. McCormick fell beside him, wounded. Hollis returned fire as Nelson shifted position, firing again until silence reclaimed the woods. He then seized the agents' weapons, a Thompson submachine gun and pistols, along with their car keys, and drove away in their Ford. Baum's body lay sprawled beside the vehicle, face turned toward the sky, uniform dark with blood. The Bureau's first fatality at the hands of Nelson was recorded not by witnesses, but by aftermath. Back at the lodge, the remaining agents, unaware of Baum's death, exchanged gunfire with fleeing figures they could barely identify. Van Meter and Dillinger escaped down a ravine. Carol fled in another car, and Helen was captured hours later, walking along the roadside in shock. When dawn arrived, the Bureau realized the scope of failure. One agent dead, another wounded, several civilians injured, and every primary target gone. The newspapers named it the Little Bohemia Disaster. Hoover, furious, ordered the largest manhunt in federal history. The photograph of the boyish gunman, who had killed Agent Baum, became a symbol of everything the Bureau vowed to eliminate. Nelson's escape through the Wisconsin forest stretched over 2 days and nights. The landscape was a maze of thawing snow, creeks swollen with meltwater, and miles of uninhabited woods. He traveled light, rifle, stolen cash, wet ammunition, and the iron will that had guided him since Joliet. Each farmhouse he passed represented both refuge and risk. He stole food, swapped vehicles twice, and slept once in a drainage culvert beneath a rural road. The cold gnawed at his hands, fatigue blurred direction, yet instinct remained precise. By the time he reached Illinois, his face was raw from windburn, his clothes torn, his energy undiminished by exhaustion. In Chicago, the city's underworld reeled at the news. The killing of a federal agent changed the rules. Bank robbers had long been hunted as criminals. Nelson's act made him an enemy of the state. His associates began to distance themselves, but he cared little for alliances. The death of Baum, to him, was consequence, not crisis. He collected Helen, after her brief detainment, secured through the gang's remaining network, and disappeared into the sprawl of safe apartments, scattered through the city's industrial edges. The Bureau, already humiliated, responded with unmatched aggression. For months afterward, agents combed Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois, raiding hideouts and interrogating informants. Each raid brought small captures, none of significance. Nelson and Chase, reunited once more, remained invisible, financed by a dwindling cache of stolen money and the occasional robbery. Helen's resilience hardened. Fear had long since transformed into resignation. She accepted every relocation without complaint, every new alias, without hesitation. The three moved like migrating shadows, leaving behind empty rooms and faint traces of burnt documents. The Bureau's internal memos reflected growing desperation. Reports described Nelson as unstable yet methodical, capable of switching from calculated calm to violent explosion in seconds. Agents were warned not to approach without overwhelming force. Hoover circulated his photograph nationwide, labeling him public enemy number 1 after Dillinger's eventual death that summer. The title was both curse and crown, validation for a man who measured himself by pursuit. Through mid-1934, the consequences of Little Bohemia reshaped American law enforcement. Congress expanded Bureau authority, authorizing agents to carry weapons and make arrests without local consent. Hoover's men trained in marksmanship using Nelson's methods as case studies. The necessity of overwhelming firepower, the unpredictability of single combatants. The agency that had been humiliated in Wisconsin was reborn in response to the man who had humiliated it. For Nelson, the manhunt altered everything, yet changed. Nothing fundamental. He still believed movement equaled survival. He stole cars with increasing frequency, switching plates and colors to confuse pursuit. Every engine noise behind him signaled vigilance rather than fear. He avoided large cities, preferring small towns where news traveled slowly and suspicion slower. His health, however, began to decline. Old wounds reopened. His nerves twitched under the weight of constant readiness. The adrenaline that once sharpened him now kept him awake for days at a time. Meanwhile, Chase began to sense inevitability. He admired Nelson's nerve but saw the narrowing horizon. The Bureau's network growing. State police now sharing radio frequencies. Public sentiment turning hostile. Each robbery required more risk for less return. Yet loyalty, the final remnant of their shared years, kept him from departure. Together they moved across the Midwest, robbing banks in Sioux Falls and Brainerd, clashing with police in Chicago suburbs, surviving on luck measured in inches. The memory of Little Bohemia haunted every chase thereafter. For the Bureau, it symbolized unfinished business. For Nelson, it was a moment of triumph, disguised as failure, the proof that he could shatter federal discipline single-handedly. He carried Baum's stolen Thompson gun for months, cleaned it meticulously, and used it in later robberies. The weapon became both trophy and curse, binding him to the very agency sworn to destroy him. Helen watched the transformation quietly. She understood that the man beside her was already living on borrowed time. By autumn, the manhunt that began in the Wisconsin woods stretched into an unbroken chain across the Midwest. Every police car in the region carried orders to fire without warning. Nelson's photograph hung in post offices beside Dillinger's ghost and Floyd's shadow, completing the trinity of America's outlaw age. The nation's fascination shifted from admiration to fatigue. The romance of the gangster was ending, replaced by the efficiency of the Bureau's new power. Yet Nelson, unaware or indifferent, drove onward through it all, the sound of the Ford engine as constant as the pulse in his temple. Little Bohemia had not just exposed him, it had defined him. The short gunman who vanished into the pines had become a national obsession, a case study, a cautionary tale in progress. The Bureau's humiliation demanded closure, and closure in that era meant death. The trail from Wisconsin led forward in a straight line through the summer's heat, through autumn's dust, toward the road outside Barrington, where everything would converge again, under cold gray sky. But for now, in the lingering echo of 1934's spring, Nelson remained unbroken, alive, armed, and forever at war with the idea of surrender. The summer of 1934 opened under the shadow of pursuit. Across the Midwest, the Bureau's new authority turned every patrolman into an extension of federal reach. Radio networks transmitted bulletins hourly. Newspapers printed faces beside the word "wanted" in block capitals. The American outlaw, once a figure of fascination, had become a liability to be erased. For the Bureau, Little Bohemia remained unfinished business. For Lester Gillis, now elevated to public enemy number one, the manhunt was validation, a final measure of his own endurance. June found him moving constantly between Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, with John Paul Chase beside him and Helen never far behind. Their stolen Ford V8 carried rifles, shotguns, and ammunition packed in flour sacks. Each day brought another route: back roads, farm lanes, river crossings, gas stations at dawn. They slept in cabins, rented under aliases, or in cars parked near cornfields. Rest meant vulnerability. Motion meant life. Nelson had lived this way so long that normal existence seemed mythic, a fantasy belonging to others. His reflexes were honed to mechanical precision, but fatigue had begun to shape him more deeply than he realized. The Bureau's files expanded with every sighting. Reports came from Iowa, South Dakota, and Michigan. A small man with a wide grin, armed and reckless, traveling with a woman and another man. Each encounter left bullet holes and spent casings as signatures. The killings of agents Baum, Cowley, and Hollis still lay in the future, but the pattern leading toward them was already fixed. Short confrontations escalating into execution-level violence. Nelson no longer robbed for money alone. Each heist had become an assertion of control in a world closing around him. On June 30th, the gang struck the Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana. The job was meant as routine, getaway money to replenish resources depleted after Little Bohemia. But as always, routine dissolved under chaos. A policeman across the street recognized the stolen Hudson, in which they had arrived. Shots rang before Nelson reached the teller's cage. He pivoted instantly, firing through the doorway toward the patrol car. The officer fell dead, bullets ricocheting off brick walls and parked vehicles. Chase drove the car forward as Nelson leapt inside, casing still warm in his hands. The robbery netted little more than a few $1,000s, but carried immense cost. The Bureau's confirmation that the small killer of Wisconsin was again on the move. By early July, John Dillinger was dead, shot outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago, betrayed by informants and surrounded by federal agents. His death ended one chapter and began another. The title Public Enemy Number 1 passed formally to Nelson, though the Bureau's internal memoranda used another description: most dangerous individual in the United States. Hoover's directives grew absolute: no negotiation, no capture, no mercy. Nelson's photograph, magnified and retouched, appeared in every newspaper, his grin frozen above the caption, "Armed and extremely dangerous." The reward reached $10,000, the equivalent of a lifetime's wages for many Depression-era men. Yet even with bounty hunters, sheriffs, and agents hunting him, Nelson remained ahead, if only by hours. Through July and August, he zigzagged across the Midwest, alternating between hiding and attack. In Wisconsin, he robbed small-town banks, where alarm systems were obsolete. In Minnesota, he ambushed a transport truck carrying factory payrolls. Each crime followed the same pattern: arrival in daylight, Entry with swift precision, violence when met with resistance, escape before reinforcements arrived. Witnesses described a man whose expression never changed, even as bullets tore plaster from walls. He moved as though calculation had replaced fear. The Bureau's new field commander, Inspector Samuel P. Cowley, took personal charge of the pursuit. Cowley, meticulous and methodical, transformed the hunt into a campaign. He established communication lines between state police forces, shared vehicle descriptions by radio, and assigned rotating surveillance teams to Chicago's outskirts. Agents memorized Nelson's aliases and Helen's wardrobe. Every roadside cafe, garage, and cheap hotel fell under observation. Yet Nelson slipped through each perimeter like vapor, altering his path whenever patterns threatened exposure. He was not lucky. He was disciplined. Each survival was the result of preparation rehearsed in silence. That silence extended to Helen and Chase. The trio's relationship had evolved into routine indistinguishable from captivity. Helen handled supplies, Chase maintained vehicles, and Nelson directed. Conversation rarely exceeded the functional. They spoke through motion, Helen handing a loaded magazine, Chase adjusting the engine belt, Nelson tapping the map with his finger to indicate the next target. In this triad, words had become unnecessary, and perhaps dangerous. Every sound carried risk of recognition. Every pause could signal fatigue. During August, they found temporary refuge in a rented cottage near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, under the names Mr. and Mrs. Garrison. For several weeks, they lived almost normally. Helen cleaned, cooked, and read newspapers aloud. Nelson repaired weapons at the table. Chase maintained the Ford in a nearby shed. The calm was deceptive. Patrols increased daily. One evening, an unmarked car passed slowly along the road, headlights sweeping the windows. Nelson extinguished the lamps and listened to the engine fade. Within an hour they were gone. The cottage left empty, except for cigarette ash and a single unmade bed. By September, the manhunt had acquired rhythm. Pursuit and disappearance, repeating across states. Federal agents grew frustrated. Each time Nelson surfaced, the geography of law adjusted itself around him. But too late. His movements formed a pattern of mockery. He crossed state lines as easily as others crossed streets, exploiting the Bureau's new but still untested jurisdiction. The same highways that carried farm produce carried him toward the next robbery. In late September, Nelson and Chase executed a payroll robbery near Brainerd, Minnesota. The job was brutal. 2 guards dead, 1 injured, and the cash secured in minutes. Local police responded within 15 minutes, but by then the Ford was gone, racing south through fields and back roads. Nelson's precision behind the wheel was unmatched. He drove as though road and machine shared a single pulse. Chase reloaded magazines beside him, hands steady despite the vibration of speed. Behind them, the Bureau assembled an ever-expanding convoy of agents, determined to end the cycle before winter. Nelson's health began to falter under the strain. His left shoulder, injured in an earlier shootout, stiffened during cold nights. He hid the pain with gritted endurance. Sleep came in fragments, nerves twitched constantly under skin pale from confinement in cars. Helen noticed but said nothing. Each morning he awoke before dawn, checked the weapons, and stared through the windshield, as though expecting pursuit to materialize from fog. The rhythm of paranoia had replaced life. October brought another killing. In a small town near Chicago, 2 highway patrolmen stopped a speeding car for a minor violation. Inside sat Nelson and Chase. The officers approached unaware. What followed lasted seconds. Bullets cracked through glass. One officer fell instantly, the other wounded. Nelson's need for survival overrode every other instinct. They sped away, leaving behind another scene marked by precision and finality. The Bureau's reports now used a single term to describe him: Triggerman without hesitation. National newspapers amplified the hysteria. Headlines read, "Little killer outshoots feds again," and "Babyface defies nation's police." For a public recovering from the Depression, the stories mixed fear and fascination. Children collected trading cards of outlaws. Adults demanded order. Hoover seized the moment to consolidate power. Under his direction, the Bureau transformed into an armed federal police force. The deaths Nelson left behind had built the foundation of modern law enforcement more effectively than any legislation could. Through that same October, Chase grew uneasy. He had followed Nelson from California to Wisconsin, from smuggling to murder, and saw no escape except death. He said little but planned contingencies. Safe houses of his own, cash hidden separately. Yet when Nelson proposed another robbery, he followed. Habit had replaced choice. The outlaw life bound them as tightly as handcuffs once had. The Bureau's final net began to close in November. Cowley relocated command to Chicago, establishing surveillance on all known associates. Agents tailed Helen's relatives, traced telegrams, and cross-referenced vehicle registrations. They learned that Nelson favored certain gas stations along Northwest Highway, near the small town of Barrington. The pattern would soon lead to collision. In those final weeks, Nelson seemed to accelerate toward his end. He robbed less for money than for motion, as though speed itself could stave off fate. Every new car he stole bore the scent of gasoline and inevitability. Each mile narrowed options further. Helen remained beside him, silent as ever, her loyalty fused to exhaustion. Chase, increasingly wary, began noticing more bureau cars along roads they had once traveled unobserved. The safe world of 1932, the world of drifting invisibility, was gone. Every town now carried radio, telephone, and coordination. The age of lone fugitives was ending. In mid-November, agents intercepted a report of a 1934 Ford V8 matching Nelson's known preference near Wilmette. The sighting triggered a chain of alerts that spread across Illinois. Within hours, patrols mobilized. Unmarked cars idled at intersections. Bureau radios pulsed with updates. Nelson and his companions, unaware of the tightening perimeter, continued their pattern, driving aimlessly to maintain readiness. The next encounter would not be an ambush or a plan. It would be collision born of repetition. As the last days of November approached, Chicago's weather turned cold again. Wind swept over the flatlands, carrying the smell of gasoline and frost. Nelson's eyes, once alert with calculation, had grown hollow from fatigue. He drove with gloved hands, his movements automatic, the routine of a man who had lived too long on the edge of pursuit. The roads he knew by memory led northwest toward Barrington, a town whose quiet streets would soon absorb more gunfire than any battlefield that decade. By then, even the Bureau understood the pattern. Nelson never fled. He attacked. Every encounter ended in escalation. Agents assigned to intercept him were instructed accordingly. If he appeared, shoot first. The nation, weary of headlines, waited for closure. The manhunt that had begun in Wisconsin 18 months earlier was converging upon a single highway under gray November sky. The Ford that carried Nelson, Helen, and Chase rolled through the cold air toward inevitability, its engine humming the rhythm of fate. The next act would begin with the sound of pursuit engines rising behind them and end with silence on the roadside outside Barrington. Between those moments stretched the final measure of violence that defined an era. By the time autumn arrived in 1934, the man once known for speed had begun to move like a shadow pursued by its own echo. Lester Gillis, baby-faced Nelson to the nation, lived within a pattern of roads that folded endlessly upon themselves. The open highways of the Midwest, once symbols of escape, had become corridors of attrition. Each town blurred into the next. A gas station, a diner, a church steeple, and beyond them, the inevitability of pursuit. After the South Bend robbery and the Bureau's redoubling of effort, Nelson, John Paul Chase, and Helen drifted west, then east again, tracing a looping route across Nebraska, South Dakota, and Illinois. They traveled under false registrations, switching cars whenever suspicion thickened. Each morning began with the same ritual. Nelson cleaning weapons in silence, while Chase studied maps, and Helen packed the few possessions they carried. They were three people bound not by trust or ambition anymore, but by exhaustion and habit. Nelson's body was failing before his will did. The years of driving, shooting, and sleeplessness had eroded him into a collection of reactions. His left arm, scarred from earlier gunfire, stiffened in the cold. His chest ached from strain. His face, once deceptively boyish, had hardened into the taut, pallid mask of a man who no longer belonged to any place. Yet the intensity in his eyes remained. Every gas pump reflected that same watchfulness, the refusal to admit fatigue even as it consumed him. The Bureau's transformation into a national force was now complete. Hoover's agents carried automatic weapons, radios, and authority that transcended state lines. Nelson's name, printed beneath the words, "Public Enemy Number 1, had become shorthand for federal resolve. Posters hung in post offices, train depots, and police stations. Each carried the same smiling photograph from years earlier, an image that no longer resembled the worn figure behind the wheel of the Ford. The myth had replaced the man, and Nelson seemed determined to live up to it until it killed him. They found brief refuge in Nevada, renting a cabin near Reno under aliases that fooled no one for long. Locals noted the strange trio: the short man who paid in cash, the woman who seldom spoke, and the quiet companion who maintained their car with mechanical devotion. Within weeks, reports reached the Bureau. Nelson sensed it before confirmation arrived. One night, he doused the cabin's kerosene lamp, packed in minutes, and drove east through the desert before dawn. The pattern repeated endlessly: arrival, suspicion, flight. As the days shortened, the land itself seemed to close around them. The Midwest turned gray with harvest dust and early frost. The sound of leaves scraping the windshield marked the season's decline. Nelson drove without direction, circling between Omaha, Des Moines, and Chicago, avoiding main roads, but never staying far from them. The Ford's engine became a kind of metronome, steady and inevitable. When it idled, Silence felt unnatural. Chase grew quieter, his loyalty eroding into weary compliance. He admired Nelson's fearlessness, but recognized its futility. The Bureau's coordination had evolved beyond anything they had faced before. Every new robbery risked instant pursuit by agents whose radios crackled with synchronized updates. Chase began counting the unmarked cars they passed each day, estimating how close they were to entrapment. Helen saw it too, but kept faith where logic failed. Her world had narrowed entirely to Nelson's survival. His death would render her existence meaningless, yet his living dragged her deeper into inevitability. Money was dwindling. The gang's bank targets were fewer, their methods predictable. Nelson compensated with increasing ferocity. When confronted, he attacked first and thought later. On one October afternoon, they stopped at a roadside cafe near Dubuque, Iowa, to rest. Two local deputies entered moments later, glancing suspiciously at the car outside. Nelson noticed their uniforms in the reflection of the window, rose without hesitation, and fired before they could turn. The officers fell instantly. Nelson paid the cashier, walked out, and drove away. The act was pure instinct. No robbery, no gain, only survival through violence. It confirmed to Chase that the man beside him had crossed from calculation to inevitability. The Bureau's records from that month show a growing pattern of random aggression. Agents pieced together testimonies. A man matching Nelson's height spotted near a gas station in Sioux City. Gunfire reported on a rural Illinois road. A Ford abandoned near Peoria, riddled with bullets. Each incident extended the trail, yet none brought capture. Nelson moved faster than coordination, surviving by seconds and geography. As November approached, illness began to claim him. Persistent fever and pain from old wounds slowed his reflexes. He hid the weakness from Helen and Chase, masking it with bursts of activity. He cleaned his guns obsessively, rearranged their travel bags, and mapped routes with unnecessary precision. When he slept, nightmares of prison and pursuit jolted him awake. The sound of engines in the distance made his hand instinctively reach for the pistol beside his bedroll. Helen's face had grown pale from months of sleepless travel. She carried scars from near misses and a quiet resolve that bordered on fatalism. To her, the world beyond Nelson's orbit had ceased to exist. Newspapers that called her accomplice or gun moll misunderstood completely. She was not a participant, but a remnant, surviving because he did. In her silence lived both devotion and despair. Their path turned back toward Illinois, the place where everything had begun. The roads leading east carried echoes of old pursuits, police sirens, gunfire, the faces of men now long dead. Nelson's driving became erratic, alternating between bursts of reckless speed and long stretches of drifting idleness. He spoke little, eyes fixed on the horizon as if following something invisible ahead. Chase noticed the difference in his reactions, hesitation where once there had been instinct. The killer of Little Bohemia was fading beneath exhaustion and infection, though his resolve showed no cracks. On November 26, they crossed into the outskirts of Chicago, staying briefly with sympathetic acquaintances who still owed Nelson loyalty from earlier years. The city had changed since Dillinger's death. Police more vigilant, neighborhoods patrolled by federal units. Nelson sensed surveillance everywhere, the rhythm of footsteps outside, the distant hum of idling cars. After a single night, he insisted they leave. They packed before dawn and drove northwest toward Barrington, unaware that their escape route had already been charted by the Bureau. The Bureau's Chicago field office, under Inspector Cowley and Agent Herman Hollis, had narrowed Nelson's pattern through analysis of his vehicle choices and movement. They knew he favored certain roads leading toward the northern suburbs. Agents were deployed in unmarked cars along Northwest Highway, instructed to intercept but not approach without reinforcement. The manhunt that had stretched across 2 years was condensing to a single point on the map. On the morning of November 27th, Nelson woke before sunrise in a rented room outside Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. He stood at the window, watching fog drift above the fields. The air carried the sharp chill of early winter. He loaded the Ford with weapons, 2 rifles, a shotgun, and several pistols, while Helen packed clothing into canvas bags. Chase checked the oil and tightened the fan belt. The ritual was mechanical, perfected by repetition. None of them spoke as the car rolled onto the highway. The sky brightened slowly behind gray clouds. They followed the route south toward Chicago, unaware that fate waited just ahead in the form of federal surveillance. Behind them, Bureau radio transmissions, synchronized across channels, vehicle matching description traveling south on Route 12. Prepare to intercept. Patrol cars positioned themselves at intervals. Agents readied their weapons. The convergence was near, though neither side yet knew the hour. As they drove, Nelson's breathing grew shallow. The fever that had haunted him for weeks returned, beads of sweat forming beneath his collar. Despite the cold, Helen noticed and placed her hand briefly on his arm, a gesture without words. Chase kept his eyes on the mirrors. The Ford's engine hummed flawlessly, an instrument of speed that would soon become an instrument of death. Ahead lay Fox River Grove, then Barrington, names that would soon mark the boundary between history and myth. The road narrowed, flanked by bare trees and telephone poles. Traffic was sparse. In the distance, an unmarked Ford sedan appeared, heading in the opposite direction. Inside were two bureau agents, Thomas McDade and William Ryan, patrolling the same stretch. Their eyes met Nelson's for an instant. As the cars passed each other at high speed, recognition flickered on both sides. McDade turned sharply, tires shrieking, beginning pursuit. The chase that would end the outlaw era had begun. As the Ford accelerated, Nelson's fatigue vanished under adrenaline. He shifted gears, engine roaring, eyes narrowing to slits of focus. Helen braced herself, and Chase reached for the rifles in the back seat. The highway ahead curved toward Barrington. The Bureau's car closed rapidly from behind. Each side now understood the stakes. For the agents, it was duty. For Nelson, it was the culmination of every road he had ever taken. The Ford tore through the November air, exhaust pluming white against the gray horizon. In those moments before the first shots, everything converged. The boy from Chicago's alleys, the fugitive from Joliet, the killer from Little Bohemia, the man who refused surrender. He had outlasted them all, but the distance was finally gone. The long road that had defined his life was narrowing to a point of no return. Morning broke cold and metallic. Over northern Illinois, a gray sky pressed low against the farmland. The horizon filmed with frost. The highways carried only the occasional commuter or delivery truck. The rest of the state seemed suspended between seasons. Along that quiet road network moved a single dark Ford V8, its exhaust leaving brief white trails that vanished in the chill. Inside sat three fugitives. Nelson at the wheel, Helen beside him, John Paul Chase in the rear, each worn to translucence by months of flight. The car smelled of oil, metal, and wet wool. The heater hissed weakly. They had been on the road since dawn, following no clear plan beyond motion itself. Behind them, an entire agency was moving in silent orbit. From Chicago's field office, Inspector Samuel P. Cowley and Agent Herman Hollis had coordinated patrol patterns along Northwest Highway, responding to a tip of a stolen Ford matching Nelson's preference. The instructions were precise: observe, confirm, pursue only with reinforcements. Yet inevitability ignores instruction. Chance aligned their routes just after noon, near Fox River Grove. At 11:30 a.m., the fugitives passed a service station where two other bureau men, Thomas McDade and William Ryan, were refueling. Ryan noticed the Ford instantly. Dark maroon body, mismatched plates, 3 occupants. He turned his head as it passed and saw the driver's sharp profile, the narrow mouth, the gloved hands gripping the wheel. Recognition required no second glance. Within moments, the agents were in pursuit, sirenless, their car pushing 60 through the frost-damp air. In Nelson's mirror, the shape of the pursuing sedan expanded. He shifted gears, the Ford's engine answering with a guttural rise. Chase reached for the rifle on the floorboard, his movements automatic. Helen braced against the door. The chase that would close the era began with a single movement of a clutch pedal. The road ahead narrowed between open fields and thin stands of leafless trees. Wind scattered bits of snow across the asphalt. The cars closed distance quickly. Bullets cracked from Nelson's window, the sound snapping through the cold air. Glass exploded from the agent's windshield. Their vehicle swerved, but held course. McDade returned fire through the side window, rounds sparking against the Ford's fender. Each shot carved silence into fragments. Other motorists pulled to the shoulders, watching two unmarked sedans trade gunfire at 70 miles per hour. Minutes later, Cowley and Hollis, alerted by radio, sighted both cars barreling south toward Barrington. They accelerated to intercept. The highway curved near the Parkside filling station, a modest roadside stop of 2 pumps, a small shack, and a shallow drainage ditch beyond. The location would become legend by accident alone. Nelson, seeing the intersection ahead, veered toward the station. The Ford skidded across gravel, steam rising from its pierced radiator. The chase had lasted less than 10 minutes. Nelson leapt out before the car stopped moving. The air smelled of fuel and metal. He took cover behind the front bumper, firing immediately at the approaching Bureau sedan. Helen crouched near the running board. Chase moved toward the rear, loading the Thompson that had once belonged to Agent Baum. From the road, Cowley and Hollis braked hard and exited their car, weapons drawn, taking cover behind doors. Their training told them to flank. Instinct told them time was short. The space between them, 40 yards of open highway, became a killing ground. Gunfire erupted with mechanical rhythm. Nelson's rifle barked first, bullets ripping through the Bureau car's windshield. Hollis fired the Thompson in reply, muzzle flash lighting the gray air. The sound was unbearable. 2 automatic weapons hammering in counterpoint, echoing off the filling station walls. The first volley struck Cowley in the chest. He staggered, but remained upright, returning fire with measured precision. One of his rounds caught Nelson high in the abdomen. The outlaw flinched, Steadying himself against the hood, he kept shooting. Hollis advanced a few steps to get clear line of fire. Nelson pivoted and hit him through the head. The agent collapsed beside the ditch, his Thompson still clutched in hand. Cowley, bleeding heavily, fired until his pistol emptied and fell against the rear door of his car. Within seconds, both agents were down, and the battle's rhythm faded into an after-echo of spent shells tumbling onto frozen ground. The fight had lasted less than 5 minutes and left 3 men mortally wounded. Smoke drifted through the cold air. The filling station attendant crouched behind a pump, hands over ears. Helen rose from behind the car, her coat torn by shrapnel. Nelson, his face gray and lips bloodless, slumped against the fender, still holding the rifle. He looked down at his shirt, the fabric dark and wet from stomach and side wounds. Breathing came in short bursts. He reloaded by habit, each motion slower than the last. Chase dragged him toward the agent's sedan, the only vehicle still operable. Helen followed, gathering weapons and bags. They pushed Nelson into the back seat and drove away, leaving the maroon Ford hissing steam beside 2 fallen agents. The sound of its engine faded into distance, swallowed by the flat landscape. For half an hour, the stolen bureau car moved south, through back roads, windows fogging with condensation. Helen drove while Chase navigated. In the rear seat, Nelson lay curled, blood soaking the upholstery. Each breath came wet and ragged, each turn of the wheels measured by the sound of his labored lungs. He said little, if anything. His eyes stared at nothing, yet his hand remained on the pistol grip of his gun. The sun dropped behind the trees, casting long lines of amber across the dashboard. The road that had carried him through a career of speed was now a funeral road. They passed through North Rand Road, turning toward the suburbs north of Chicago. By the time they reached Niles Center Cemetery, Nelson's breathing had slowed to a series of shallow gasps. Blood pooled at his feet. His face had taken on a waxen pallor. He tried to lift himself once, failed, and sank back. Helen pulled to the side of a gravel lane beneath bare oaks. The engine idled. Nelson exhaled once more and did not inhale again. He was 26 years old. Silence filled the car. For a moment, neither Helen nor Chase moved. Then they acted with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed the unthinkable. They dragged the body from the rear seat and laid it beside a hedge near the cemetery fence. Helen spread a blanket over him, straightened his collar, and stepped back. The wind stirred through the trees, lifting fallen leaves around his still form. No words were spoken. They climbed back into the car and drove away into the dark. Within an hour, the Bureau knew something had happened. Calls poured into Chicago police headquarters, reporting a gunfight at Barrington. Local officers arrived to find 2 federal agents dead beside the highway. Their weapons missing, their car gone. Casings from a Winchester rifle and a Thompson machine gun littered the ground. The filling station attendant, still in shock, described the attack in stammered details. A short man with a round face and terrible precision. The scene was photographed, measured, and reported to Hoover within hours. The director read the telegram in silence, then issued orders for nationwide alert. Subject believed critically wounded. Capture imminent. Late that night, officers patrolling the cemetery lane found the body beneath the blanket. The face, though pale and blood-spattered, was instantly recognizable from wanted posters. Fingerprints confirmed it the next morning. The nation's most wanted man had died less than 4 hours after the shootout that claimed the Bureau's finest. Photographs of his corpse circulated within days, proof that the gangster age was finished. The press published side-by-side images, Nelson's smiling portrait, and his bullet-riddled car by the roadside, its radiator still steaming. Hoover's public statement was measured and final. The war on crime has been won. Internally, the Bureau studied every second of the Barrington ambush. Positions, weapons, angles. Nelson's relentless offense under mortal wounds became a lesson in both bravery and madness. His death, like his life, was recorded in meticulous detail. 37 bullet holes in his car, 17 in his body, and one nation at last, relieved of its most persistent ghost. At St. Joseph's Cemetery in River Grove, his family claimed the body and buried it under his real name, Lester Joseph Gillis. No epitaph marked the grave. Helen, arrested weeks later and sentenced to a short term in federal prison, never spoke of that day again. Chase fled west and was captured the following year. He served decades at Alcatraz, the final link to a story that had ended on a cold Illinois road. The site of the ambush changed over time. The gas station was rebuilt. The road widened. The ditches filled. Commuters drove past, without knowing that beneath their tires lay the earth that once drank the blood of 3 men. Yet the name Barrington remained etched in the Bureau's archives as the moment when the last outlaw fell and the modern federal age began. In the official report, the summary ran 4 sentences. Subject encountered agents Cowley and Hollis on Northwest Highway, near Barrington, Illinois. Gunfight ensued. Both agents killed in the line of duty. Subject died of wounds later that evening. The brevity belied the violence that had reshaped law enforcement and ended the age of the machine gun outlaw. For the nation, The story closed there, with a dead gangster and a new heroic bureaucracy. But for those who had chased or followed him, the echo lingered in night highways and engine noise. Every road still seemed to carry his shadow, short, fast, and defiant, burned into the American memory, like a spent shell in asphalt. The Barrington ambush was not merely an ending. It was the moment when the country itself shifted gears, leaving behind its romance with outlaws, for the efficiency of the state. By the end of November 1934, winter had settled over Illinois like a lid. The snow arrived thin at first, drifting across the blackened earth, where the gun battle had raged. At Barrington, traffic resumed within days, the scent of gunpowder replaced by exhaust fumes, the gravel rinsed clean by rain. Only faint bullet scars on the filling station wall testified that, for 5 minutes, that stretch of highway had been the center of the nation's war on crime. The Bureau marked the site, photographed it, and moved on. Their quarry was gone. The age that had produced him was closing in frost. In Chicago, the news broke before midnight. Radio announcers read the bulletin in even tones. Public enemy number 1 slain in gunfight with federal agents near Barrington, Illinois. Newspaper presses rolled until dawn, printing his photograph beneath headlines that declared final victory. The public awoke to images of the wrecked Ford, riddled with holes, its radiators steaming like a dying animal. For a population weary of depression headlines, the story carried both satisfaction and unease. Satisfaction that the long manhunt had ended, unease at the price paid. 2 federal agents lay dead beside the man they had pursued. The Bureau had won, but not cleanly. At headquarters in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover read the first telegrams in silence. He issued statements that balanced triumph with solemnity. The fallen agents honored, the Bureau vindicated. Within hours, Cowley and Hollis were declared heroes of the new federal order. Their funerals in Chicago drew processions of uniformed men, ranks stretching down snow-lined streets. The flags on Bureau buildings hung at half-mast. Brass bands played hymns, whose notes froze in the winter air. In their coffins lay the final casualties of a decade-long experiment, the transformation of loosely organized investigators into a national police force. Their deaths gave the Bureau its martyrdom. Their opponent's body gave it legitimacy. Nelson's corpse, recovered from the cemetery lane where Helen and Chase had left it, was examined at the Cook County morgue. The inventory was clinical: 17 bullet wounds, 4 fatal 5-caliber slugs retrieved from chest and abdomen, clothing shredded, pockets containing $5 in change and a cheap watch. His fingerprints confirmed identity, though the face was scarcely recognizable. Bloated wax gray, mouth half open, as though the last breath still lingered. Agents filed through the autopsy room in rotation, some out of duty, others out of disbelief. The boyish grin from wanted posters had dissolved into a mask of ruin. The photographs taken that night would circulate through every Bureau classroom for decades, as proof of consequence. Helen and Chase drove south through the dark, after abandoning the body. By morning they reached Chicago, ditching the Bureau car in an alley off Milwaukee Avenue, and separating. Helen found shelter with relatives who dared not question her arrival. She slept for 30 hours straight, awakening to headlines that confirmed what she already knew. The photograph of the corpse, the words "dead, baby face Nelson," left no space for denial. Within days she was traced, arrested, and charged with harboring a fugitive. Reporters waited outside the courthouse, shouting questions she never answered. Her face, veiled and expressionless, appeared on front pages, beneath captions naming her the outlaw widow. A federal judge sentenced her to a short prison term, a gesture of law more symbolic than punitive. When released, she vanished quietly into anonymity, living the remainder of her life under borrowed names, the echo of gunfire following her like weather. Chase fled west alone, driving through snow toward California, with pockets of cash and the Bureau's stolen weapons. His world had shrunk to highways and fear. The man who once tuned engines with calm precision now drove in silence, glancing at mirrors every few seconds. For months he evaded capture, working odd jobs under false identities, moving between San Francisco and the coastal hills. But invisibility decays with time. In 1935, a routine police stop exposed him. Fingerprints told the rest. Federal agents arrived within hours. Chase surrendered without resistance, the only surviving participant of the Barrington gunfight. His trial in Chicago drew packed galleries. The prosecution framed him as accomplice to the murders of agents Cowley and Hollis, emphasizing every bullet fired in those final minutes. Witnesses from the Bureau described Nelson's fury, Chase's presence, Helen's flight. Exhibits included the Thompson machine gun, retrieved from the stolen Bureau car, and fragments of the Ford's windshield spidered with cracks. The defense argued duress, that Chase had acted under fear of Nelson's volatility, but the verdict was foregone. On March 17, 1935, a federal jury found him guilty. He received a life sentence, and was later transferred to the new federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island, a gray fortress rising from the San Francisco Bay. There he joined remnants of the same generation, bank robbers, killers, and fugitives, who had filled America's imagination, and now filled its most secure prison. For the Bureau, Barrington became doctrine, Internal memoranda analyzed every second of the confrontation. Approach angles, ammunition, communication failures. The lesson was codified into new field manuals. Never underestimate. Never approach without superior firepower. Never assume surrender. Agents trained with automatic weapons under instructors who invoked Nelson's name as shorthand for danger. To recruits, he was no longer man but myth. A case study in the necessity of control. His death marked the Bureau's birth as a paramilitary institution. His violence justified the transformation. Public fascination faded as swiftly as it had risen. Within months, newspapers shifted to other headlines. New crimes, new wars abroad, new political movements. Yet the residue of the gangster decade lingered in film reels and pulp novels. Hollywood turned the real events into stylized legend. Gunfire staged in studio alleys. Actors mimicking the quick gestures of men who had once bled on Midwestern roads. Audiences watched the dramatizations with equal parts nostalgia and relief, sensing that the wildness had been tamed. Its participants either buried or caged. Helen served her sentence quietly at the Women's Federal Reformatory in Alderson, West Virginia. Guards described her as polite, withdrawn, absorbed in routine. She spent nights sewing uniforms and days reading newspapers that seldom mentioned the past. Upon release, she returned to Chicago under another name and lived decades beyond her husband's legend, aging in obscurity. When she died in 1987, only a handful of obituaries noted that she had once been married to the most violent outlaw of 1934. Chase outlived almost all of them. On Alcatraz, he became a model prisoner, maintenance worker, quiet, obedient. The institution's rigid orders suited him. Chaos had always belonged to the other man. Years later, he was transferred to Leavenworth and eventually paroled in 1966. By then, the world had changed beyond recognition. Freeways replaced backroads. The Bureau had grown into a global apparatus, and the stories of the old gangsters belonged to museums. Chase worked as a janitor in California until his death in 1973, the last living witness to the moment when the outlaw century died in gunfire. In archives and classrooms, the photographs endured. The image of Nelson lying dead beside the hedge. Agents sprawled on the Barrington Road. Helen's veiled face before the press. These became part of America's visual memory. To historians, they marked the hinge between two eras, the anarchic violence of the Depression and the bureaucratic discipline that followed. To the Bureau, they symbolized triumph, achieved through sacrifice. To the few who had known the participants personally, they were simply the record of lives burned out before their third decade. By early 1935, Congress passed legislation formalizing the FBI's authority across state lines, citing the Dillinger and Nelson cases as justification. The new statutes legalized the pursuit that had once skirted constitutionality. In effect, the outlaw's defiance had built the framework of the law that destroyed him. Every future agent would operate under powers written in response to his crimes. Outside Barrington, the road returned to quiet routine. Farmers plowed the frozen soil that spring. Children walked to school past the rebuilt filling station, without knowing what had occurred there. The bullet-pocked wall was plastered and repainted. The drainage ditch filled. Only in Bureau archives did the coordinates remain sacred. Field agents occasionally visited the site on anniversaries, standing in the wind, measuring distances, imagining how the confrontation had unfolded second by second. In the stillness, they could almost hear the last echo of gunfire, fading into the trees. The decade that followed would bury the memory beneath other crises: the Dust Bowl, the approach of World War, the rise of new ideologies. Yet within the Bureau's internal mythology, Barrington endured as the turning point, the end of individual rebellion, the beginning of institutional order. The men who studied its files saw in Nelson both the danger of chaos and the necessity of control. His death became a parable, told to new recruits, how a single defiant man had forced the government to evolve, and how the evolution had cost 3 lives on a frozen Illinois highway. In official reports, the closing statement read simply, "Case closed." But history rarely closes cleanly. The legend of Babyface Nelson lingered in whispered exaggerations. The boyish killer who smiled under fire. The outlaw who shot until he died standing. Those who sought truth found instead the grim arithmetic of violence. 3 men dead, 2 imprisoned, 1 nation remade. When spring returned to the Midwest, the last snow melted from the roadside at Barrington. Beneath the thaw, fragments of brass casings glinted briefly before disappearing into mud. Cars passed without slowing. The age of machine gun bandits had ended not with ceremony, but with the indifference of time. What remained was the world their deaths had made, a world of order built on the ruins of speed and smoke. 2 decades after the gunfire on Northwest Highway, the legend of Lester Gillis had hardened into archive paper and police lecture slides. The men who had chased him were dead or retired, their reports yellowing in steel cabinets. The Bureau he had defied was now an empire of procedure, uniforms, badges, and fluorescent offices, replacing the rum-stained back rooms of 1930s fieldwork. Only one thread from that violent winter remained alive inside the system he had helped to define: John Paul Chase, prisoner number AZ-671 on Alcatraz Island. By 1955, Chase had spent 20 years behind walls. Alcatraz, carved into rock and salt wind, was a world of perpetual sameness. The ocean roared day and night, a noise so constant it erased memory. Cells were narrow concrete rectangles, lit by a single bulb and a slot of sky. From his window, Chase could see the gray shimmer of San Francisco across the bay, so close it seemed unreal, like a projected film. The city's lights blinked each evening while he swept corridors or scrubbed the kitchen floor, reminders of a life continuing without him. Age had subdued him. The thin, sharp-featured man, who had once tuned engines for precision, now moved with deliberate care. His hair had turned the color of ash. His hands, once steady under gunfire, trembled slightly when he held tools. The violence of 1934 survived only in muscle memory, a reflex to flinch at sudden sound. He worked maintenance duty, repairing pipes and polishing brass, until the metal reflected the ghost of his face. Guards described him as courteous, silent, obedient. He had become what the system desired: order contained within a body. Alcatraz itself was entering decline. The post-war bureaucracy that Nelson's era had helped to forge now viewed the prison as relic, a monument to old fears. New philosophy spoke of rehabilitation instead of isolation. By the late 1950s, rumors of closure circulated through the cell blocks. Chase listened without comment. He had seen reform movements rise and fade before. Walls did not vanish with ideology. Still, he noticed the younger inmates who arrived. Bank robbers of a new generation, veterans of urban post-war crime, who regarded him with curiosity. To them, he was living prehistory, a link to the mythic age of Dillinger and Nelson. Some whispered his name as though reciting folklore. Chase ignored them, focusing on work. The years had burned ambition from him, leaving only endurance. In 1958, he suffered a mild stroke during a night shift, collapsing beside the boiler room. Prison doctors revived him, though the left side of his face never fully recovered. The infirmary smelled of iodine and ocean salt. From his bed, he could hear waves battering the cliffs below, a sound identical to gunfire if one listened long enough. He counted time, by tide and temperature. Each sunrise dissolved another layer of memory, until only fragments remained. The scent of gasoline on Nelson's gloves, Helen's stillness beside him in the car, the color of the sky above Barrington turning gray before the first shot. Everything else had lost definition. When Alcatraz closed in 1963, Chase was transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. The transition felt less like liberation than relocation. The mainland prison was quieter, the routine slower, the air heavy with heat instead of salt. He worked in the machine shop repairing locks and hinges, tasks that suited his precision. The guards treated him as an elder statesman of crime, the last survivor of an extinct species. Occasionally, journalists requested interviews, hoping for anecdotes about Nelson or Dillinger. He declined them all. Silence had become his final allegiance. Outside those walls, the world that had once feared the gangster now glorified him. Television dramatized the 1930s as parable. Men in fedoras, exchanging bursts of Thompson fire beneath streetlights. Films romanticized the rebellion, trimming the brutality to fit nostalgia. The public saw stylized versions of the lives Chase had actually lived, forgetting the smell of blood and exhaust that clung to the real events. In newsreels, Hoover still appeared stern and immaculate, the architect of victory. Nelson's grin flashed briefly in montage sequences, before fading to the next headline. The nation that had built highways to hunt him now built suburbs along the same routes, its citizens commuting past the ghosts of gunfights without noticing. Chase observed this indirectly through magazines and the prison radio. The names of the dead became slogans, their crimes entertainment. He wondered what Nelson would have thought, perhaps amusement, perhaps contempt. The man who once demanded speed above all would not have endured nostalgia. He belonged to motion, not memory. Chase knew this better than anyone. He had spent decades frozen in the opposite condition, motionless, preserved. In 1965, a committee reviewed his sentence. He was 63, frail, and compliant. The Bureau raised no objection to parole. The case file, once hundreds of pages thick, had been reduced to a few forms stamped low risk. On October 31st, 1966, John Paul Chase walked through Leavenworth's main gate, carrying a small canvas bag of personal belongings: spare clothes, spectacles, a Bible, and a single photograph of San Francisco Bay, torn from a magazine. No family waited outside. A social worker escorted him to a halfway house in Oakland. The world felt impossibly loud: car horns, aircraft, neon. Every noise reminded him of machinery that once symbolized freedom. He found work as a janitor at a warehouse near the docks. The manager, unaware of his past, hired him for punctuality and quiet. Each morning he swept concrete floors, still glistening from fog. Each evening he locked the doors and watched the bay lights shimmer, where Alcatraz stood like a shadow. The island had already begun its transformation into museum. Tour boats circled it daily, guides recounting stories of gangsters and escapes, while cameras clicked. Sometimes Chase paused during lunch breaks to watch from the pier. From that distance, the cell block windows gleamed like coins. Tourists looked toward the past. He looked toward nothing. In 1970, a journalist researching the Dillinger era traced him through public records. The reporter found an old man living alone in a rented room above a laundromat in Burlingame. Chase declined an interview, but allowed one photograph, taken as he stood beside a window overlooking a gray street, broom in hand. The image appeared in a crime history magazine under the caption, "Last surviving member of the Dillinger gang." Readers saw another relic. Chase saw confirmation that anonymity was impossible. Afterward, he stopped using his real name, signing paychecks simply JP. The years blurred into sameness. He rose before dawn, cleaned the warehouse, walked home through fog. His health deteriorated quietly. Heart trouble, failing eyesight, arthritis that twisted his fingers. Yet he persisted, guided by routine as once he had been guided by escape routes. The few who knew him described a man who never raised his voice and never smiled. He attended church on Sundays, sitting in the back pew, anonymous among the faithful. To them, he was an old laborer with stiff hands. None guessed he had driven getaway cars through gunfire 40 years earlier. By 1973, he was 71. The modern world had erased nearly all memory of the one that had created him. The bureau was computerized. Agents carried identification cards instead of hand-typed warrants. The headlines were about Watergate, not machine gun bandits. The story of Barrington existed only in dusty files and fading photographs. One spring morning, Chase collapsed in his room while folding laundry. Paramedics pronounced him dead on arrival at Peninsula Hospital. The coroner's report listed natural causes: heart failure. His possessions filled a single box: clothes, eyeglasses, a Bible, and that torn picture of the bay. His body was cremated, the ashes scattered in the Pacific at his request. With his passing, the final living connection to 1934 disappeared. There were no ceremonies, no headlines. Just a line in the Bureau's internal bulletin, noting that John Paul Chase, last associate of Lester Gillis, was deceased. In the offices where his name had once been cursed, no one remembered its sound. The world he and Nelson had defied had outlived them by transforming into the very structure that defined modern America: highways, identification numbers, organized surveillance. The outlaw spirit had become the law's justification. On the 50th anniversary of the Barrington gunfight, a small historical society in Illinois placed a plaque near the site of the old filling station. Few attended the unveiling. Trucks roared past on the widened highway, drowning the speeches. The plaque bore only names: Agents Cowley, Hollis, and Lester Joseph Gillis, and a sentence noting that the confrontation marked the end of the gangster era. No mention of Helen or Chase appeared. The grass around the monument bent in the wind from passing traffic, and the sound of engines echoed faintly, as if replaying that frozen day. In museums, Nelson's Thompson gun sat behind glass, labeled Exhibit WC 1934. Its steel gleamed under display lights, preserved as artifact rather than weapon. Visitors read the placard and moved on. To them it was distant history, stripped of heat and consequence. The names Dillinger, Nelson, Floyd had become punctuation marks in lectures about law enforcement's evolution. The moral clarity of their defeat satisfied a nation that preferred tidy endings. Yet outside those exhibits, the landscape still carried the ghost of their momentum. The same roads stretched unbroken across the plains, the same horizons unguarded, except by distance. Trucks and cars thundered over asphalt, layered atop the routes once mapped by fleeing bandits. If one drove those highways at night, the view ahead remained unchanged. A tunnel of darkness broken by twin beams of light, engine humming like a heartbeat. Somewhere within that sound lingered the echo of the man who had refused to slow down. By the time Chase's name vanished from memory, the world had fully entered a new kind of order. Machines tracking machines, power exercised through information instead of gunfire. Yet the lesson of 1934 endured invisibly. Every act of enforcement, every expansion of authority, traced its lineage to those few seconds of gunfire at Barrington. Nelson's defiance had forced a nation to define the limits of freedom. His death had shown how far it would go to preserve control. Chase, by surviving, had carried the residue of that moment longer than anyone, an unwitting custodian of its meaning. In the end, there was no witness left to tell it. Only the records remained, typed pages describing trajectories and calibers, memoranda signed in blue ink, photographs marked confidential. The living energy had drained away, leaving a quiet absence where noise once ruled. History sealed the files, and the wind over the Illinois fields carried no memory of what had happened there. Yet every so often, when evening traffic thins and the horizon reddens over the Northwest Highway, the landscape still feels momentarily suspended, as if the present forgets itself and the past flickers through. In that brief silence, one can almost sense the outline of a speeding Ford, hear the rattle of automatic fire fading into distance, and imagine the young man at the wheel gripping it as though velocity alone could defeat time. Then the vision dissolves, replaced by headlights and asphalt. The road remains, indifferent and eternal, the last witness to an age that ended in smoke and motion.